In the soft light of an ancient Roman evening, as torches began to flicker to life along the streets of the Seven Hills, a young man stood at a window in the royal palace, looking out over the city that he believed should be his. His name was Lucius Tarquinius, though history would come to know him by another name, Superbus, the Proud. And in this moment, watching the sun set over Rome, he was thinking about murder, which, admittedly, is not the healthiest thought process for a prince to be having. But then again, healthy thought processes and ancient Roman politics rarely occupied the same sentence. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every ending has a beginning, and to understand how Rome came to cast out its kings forever, we must first understand the man who made such a dramatic change inevitable. We must walk with him through the corridors of power, listen to the whispered conversations in darkened rooms, and witness the slow corruption of ambition into tyranny. Or, depending on your perspective, the rapid corruption of ambition into tyranny. Tarquin was never one for patience. The story begins not with Tarquin himself, but with his father, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, Rome's fifth king. Priscus had come to Rome as an outsider, an Etruscan noble from the city of Tarquinia, who had seen opportunity in the growing city on the Tiber. He had been welcomed, had prospered, and through a combination of talent, timing, and the political maneuvering of his brilliant wife Tanaquil, had ascended to the throne itself. It was quite the success story, really. The immigrant who made good, who rose from newcomer to king through merit and ambition. Young Tarquin grew up in the palace, a prince in all but name. He watched his father rule, watched the senators bow and the people cheer. He learned to read the complex currents of Roman politics, to understand that power in this city was never simply taken. It had to be earned, negotiated, sometimes stolen. The palace was his schoolroom, and the lessons taught there were harsh ones, far harsher than anything you'd find in a normal education. Though admittedly palace life in ancient Rome wasn't exactly designed to produce well-adjusted individuals. "Your father is a great man," his mother would tell him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder as they stood on the palace balcony, looking out over the city. "He came to this city with nothing but his name and his determination. Now look at what he has built." And it was true. Tarquinius Priscus had transformed Rome. He had drained the marshy valley between the hills to create the Forum, that great public space that would become the heart of Roman civic life. He had begun construction of the great temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. He had organized the circus games and brought Etruscan sophistication to this still somewhat rustic Latin city. By any measure, he had been a successful king. It was a lovely sentiment. Unfortunately, it left out the part about what happens when someone decides they'd prefer your father not be king anymore. That lesson came later, and it was considerably less pleasant. It happened suddenly, violently. The sons of Ancus Marcius, the king who had preceded Priscus, had never forgiven the Etruscan for taking what they saw as their birthright, which is understandable, really. Nobody likes losing a throne, and the Marcius had spent years nursing their grievance until it had fermented into full-blown murderous intent. They hired men, simple shepherds drawn into a conspiracy they barely understood, to murder the king. And one day, while Tarquinius Priscus sat in judgment, hearing what he thought was a simple dispute between these false petitioners, axes flashed in the sunlight, and the king fell, his blood pooling on the palace floor. The young Tarquin, perhaps 14 or 15 years old, would have heard the screams, the running footsteps, the chaos that follows the death of a king. He would have seen his father's body, or at least been kept from seeing it by frantic servants who thought they were protecting him. He would have seen the panic in the eyes of guards who suddenly didn't know who commanded their loyalty, of officials who didn't know whether to flee or stand their ground. In that moment of confusion and terror, the world he knew shattered like dropped pottery. Palace coups, it turns out, are not tidy affairs. They create a vacuum, a moment where the old order is dead but the new order has not yet been born, and in that moment anything can happen. It's the most dangerous time in any kingdom, the interregnum, when the throne stands empty and every ambitious man begins to calculate his chances. But then something remarkable happened. His mother, Tanaquil, that clever woman who had guided her husband to the throne and helped him rule for 38 years, refused to let chaos win. She appeared at a palace window, her voice calm and commanding, addressing the crowd that had gathered below in growing panic. "The king lives," she announced, her lie bold and clear. "He was wounded, yes, but he will recover. In the meantime, he commands that all should obey Servius Tullius as they would obey the king himself." And just like that, with words alone, she changed the course of history. Servius Tullius, her son-in-law, a man of uncertain parentage who some whispered was the son of a slave woman named Lucretia, became king of Rome. Not Tarquin, not the actual son of the murdered king. Servius Tullius, One imagines young Tarquin standing there, probably being held back by guards or servants for his own protection, watching his mother engineer his own disinheritance, and thinking something along the lines of, well, this is unfortunate, though probably with more colourful language. The ancient sources don't record his exact reaction, which is probably for the best. Teenage princes who have just lost both their father and their inheritance are rarely at their most eloquent. The young prince learned a bitter lesson that day. Bloodlines meant nothing if you lacked the will and the cunning to claim what you believed was yours. He watched as Servius Tullius consolidated power over the following weeks and months, watched as the throne that should have been his, or so he believed, slipped away, secured by a clever woman's quick thinking and a weaker man's complicity. Or perhaps Servius wasn't weaker at all. Perhaps he was simply more politically skilled, better at building consensus, more willing to work with the Senate and the people, rather than demanding obedience as a right of blood. But that's not how Tarquin saw it. To him, Servius was a usurper, an interloper who had stolen what belonged to his family. It was the kind of lesson that tends to stick with a person, the kind that shapes how they view the world, and more importantly, how they plan to reshape it. Years passed, many years. Servius Tullius proved to be not just a competent king, but a transformative one. He reorganized Roman society along lines of wealth rather than birth, creating the famous centuriate system that would last long after the monarchy fell. He conducted the first census, giving Rome a clear understanding of its population and resources. He built the Great Wall that encompassed all 7 of Rome's hills, defining the city's boundaries and protecting its people. He was, by any reasonable measure, a good king, perhaps even a great one. But to Tarquin, now growing from youth into manhood, all of this success was simply salt in the wound. Every achievement of Servius Tullius was another reminder of what had been taken from him, another monument to his own dispossession. Tarquin grew from an angry youth into an ambitious man. He married one of Servius Tullius's daughters, a woman named Tullia. Their marriage at first glance might have seemed a gesture of reconciliation, a way to bind the family together and heal old wounds. The king's daughter marrying the son of the previous king. It had a nice symmetry to it, the kind of political marriage that was supposed to create stability and continuity. But if you looked closer, if you listened to the conversations that happened behind closed doors, you would have heard something different. You would have heard 2 people united, not by love, but by a shared conviction that they deserved more than what they had. He has ruled for 40 years. Tullia would whisper to her husband in the darkness of their bedchamber. 40 years, and what of you? You are the son of a king, and yet you bow to the son of a slave. He is your father, Tarquin would reply, though his voice lacked conviction. It's the sort of objection you raise when you know you should object, but your heart isn't really in it. The kind of protest that's more about maintaining the appearance of decency than any genuine moral qualm. He is a usurper, Tullia would counter, her voice hard as iron. Your father won the throne through greatness. My father stole it through trickery. Which of them truly deserves to be remembered as a king? It was not, one must admit, the healthiest marriage dynamic. But then healthy marriages rarely feature in stories about the fall of monarchies. The ancient historians, writing centuries later with the full benefit of hindsight and a desire to explain how Rome's monarchy ended in such spectacular fashion, painted Tullia as a monster of ambition, a Lady Macbeth avant la who drove her husband to ever greater crimes. Whether this characterization is fair or represents the typical historical pattern of blaming ambitious women for their husbands' failings is difficult to say. What seems clear is that Tullia and Tarquin reinforced each other's ambitions, created a feedback loop of resentment and entitlement that grew stronger with each passing year. According to the old stories, and here we must tread carefully, because the ancient historians loved a good dramatic tale and weren't always overly concerned with accuracy, there had been 4 of them once. 2 brothers, 2 sisters. Tarquin had a brother named Arrogance, quiet and decent, married to Tullia's sister, also named Tullia. The Romans were not particularly creative with names, which must have made family gatherings confusing. This other Tarquin and this other Tullia were content with their lives, asking nothing more than peace and security. They were, in essence, normal people who happened to have been born into the royal family, and who viewed that circumstance as a blessing to be enjoyed rather than an opportunity to seize more power. But our Tullia and our Tarquin, they burned with a different fire. They would see each other at family gatherings, at public ceremonies, and their eyes would meet across crowded rooms with a look of understanding. Here was someone who comprehended ambition. Here was someone who would not be satisfied with scraps from the royal table. Here was someone who wanted more, who believed they deserved more, and who was willing to do something about it. Your brother-in-law has the throne, Tullia said to Tarquin one evening, and my brother-in-law has you as a rival. We are both married to the wrong people." It was a dangerous thing to say. The kind of statement that, once spoken, changes everything. The kind of statement that makes it very difficult to go back to pretending everything is fine. Tarquin should have been shocked. Should have rebuked her for even thinking such a thing, let alone saying it aloud. Instead, he simply nodded slowly, understanding exactly what she meant and what she was proposing. "What would you have us do?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Whatever is necessary," she replied. Now, the ancient historians tell us that Aruns and the elder Tullia both died conveniently shortly after this conversation. One fell ill with a mysterious ailment that the physicians couldn't diagnose or cure. The other suffered a tragic accident. No one could prove anything, of course. These things happened. Life in ancient Rome was precarious, and death could come suddenly, even to the young and healthy. There were no autopsies, no forensic investigations, just the word of physicians who could only guess at causes, and the testimony of witnesses who might or might not be telling the truth. But people whispered. And Tarquin and Tullia, after a respectful period of mourning that neither of them truly felt, married each other, which certainly didn't help with the whispering. Whether this story is literally true, or represents later Roman embellishment, a way of making the couple even more villainous, is difficult to say. The Romans had a tendency to paint their historical villains in the darkest possible colours, to make them almost cartoonishly evil, so that their eventual downfall felt like divine justice rather than political happenstance. What we can say is that the marriage between Tarquin and Tullia became legendary for all the wrong reasons. They were presented as the perfect partnership in ambition, two people who recognized in each other a kindred spirit willing to do whatever it took to achieve power. Servius Tullius, growing older but still vigorous, still active in the governance of Rome, watched this marriage with unease. He was not a fool. He had ruled Rome for over 4 decades, had navigated countless political crises, had survived plots and conspiracies before. He could see the hunger in his daughter's eyes, could feel the barely concealed contempt in his son-in-law's formal courtesies. "I worry about them," Servius confided to his other daughter one evening, the one who had married arrogance and who now lived as a widow in quiet dignity. "There is something in their eyes, both of them, that troubles me deeply. Perhaps you should send them away," his daughter suggested, her voice gentle but worried. "Give Tarquin a governorship in one of the Latin towns. Distance might cool their ambitions, or at least keep them from causing trouble here in Rome." But Servius shook his head, his aged features thoughtful. "No, better to keep them close, where I can watch them. A serpent out of sight is more dangerous than one you can see slithering in your garden." It was a reasonable thought, the kind of cautious wisdom you'd expect from a man who had ruled successfully for decades. Unfortunately, it was also completely wrong. Servius was operating under the assumption that Tarquin would try to steal the throne through distance and conspiracy, through building support in the territories and returning with an army, the way ambitious princes usually did. He didn't understand that Tarquin was planning something far more direct, far more audacious, and far more public. And so the years passed, and Tarquin waited. But he was not idle in his waiting. He moved through Rome like a shadow king, attending to the business that Servius neglected or didn't have time for, hearing legal cases, making himself useful to the patrician families who had never quite accepted Servius's legitimacy. It started small. A patrician would approach him with a property dispute, something minor that didn't require the king's attention but did need someone with authority to resolve it. "The boundary stones between my land and my neighbours have been moved," the patrician would complain. "He claims 5 more feet of olive grove than he's entitled to." Tarquin would listen attentively, ask thoughtful questions, and render a judgment that seemed fair and reasonable. "Let us consult the old surveys," he would say. "And if the stones have indeed been moved, they shall be returned to their proper place. A man's property is sacred after all." Word spread. Tarquin was approachable. Tarquin was fair. Tarquin had time for the concerns of Rome's noble families. Before long, people were coming to him first, before bothering the king with their problems. "You have a question about inheritance law," he would say to a concerned noble whose father had just died. "Come, let us discuss it. I have time, and I believe I can help you understand the precedents. My father, after all, heard hundreds of such cases during his reign, and I learned much from watching him. Your son has been slighted by a magistrate?" He would commiserate with another. "That is not right. A noble family like yours deserves better treatment. The magistrates have forgotten their place, forgotten that they serve at the pleasure of Rome's best families. When I have influence, such things will not happen. Always when I have influence. Never if I become king." He spoke as though his eventual rule was inevitable, just a matter of time. And slowly, imperceptibly, people began to believe him. It's remarkable, really, how effective this kind of confidence can be. If you act like something is already true, others will start to treat it as true. It's a dangerous sort of magic, the power of assumption. He began to hold informal gatherings at his house, inviting the younger patricians, the ones who felt that Rome's traditional aristocracy had lost too much power under Servius's reforms. He would serve good wine, provide excellent food, and let the conversation flow in directions that just happened to favor his political interests. The census, one young noble would complain, his wine cup nearly empty. My family has served Rome for generations, and now we're counted the same as merchants and traders, ranked by mere wealth rather than by blood and honor. It is a strange system, Tarquin would agree, refilling the man's cup. My father believed in the old ways, in the natural hierarchy that the gods themselves established. But then my father actually was an aristocrat, descended from the princes of Tarquin. He understood these things in his blood. The implication hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Servius Tullius, son of a slave, could not possibly understand the needs and concerns of the nobility because he was not one of them. He was an outsider who had stumbled into power through luck and manipulation, not through any natural right or superior virtue. At home, Tullia watched her husband's careful campaign with approval, but also with growing impatience. "They love you already," she would tell him, watching from a window as yet another group of young patricians departed from one of Tarquin's gatherings. "They come to you instead of him. They ask for your judgment instead of his. They speak your name with respect and his with tolerance. How much longer will you wait?" "These things take time," Tarquin would reply, though his own impatience was beginning to match hers. "I must have more than just the support of a few young nobles. I need the Senate, or at least enough of the Senate that the rest will not dare oppose me. I need the people to at least accept the change, even if they don't actively support it." "You have all that," Tullia would insist, her frustration clear. "You're simply afraid to reach out and take what's already yours." It stung because there was truth in it. Tarquin had spent so many years planning, calculating, building support, that the actual moment of action had begun to seem impossible, like a bridge he would never quite work up the courage to cross. But Tullia would not let him remain paralyzed. "Look at him," she would say, nodding toward the forum where Servius could sometimes be seen walking. Slowly now, his steps careful, his body bent with age. He trembles when he walks. He forgets names. He falls asleep during long ceremonies. "How long will you wait, Tarquin? Until you are as old as he is? Until you're too old to enjoy what you've won?" And perhaps she was right. Perhaps Tarquin had already won the shadow war for Rome's loyalty. All that remained was to make the shadow real, to transform influence into power, to turn what was implied into what was actual. It's one thing to have people treat you like a king. It's quite another to actually sit on the throne. And that final step, that transformation from potential to actuality, required something more than careful political maneuvering. It required violence. The decision, when it finally came, was not made in a moment of passion or rage. It was calculated, planned, prepared for like a military campaign. Tarquin spent weeks ensuring he had the right supporters in the right places. He made sure the key patrician families would back him, or at least not oppose him. He cultivated relationships with members of the city guard, making certain that at the crucial moment they would look the other way rather than defend the old king. And then, one morning when the sun rose over Rome in a sky of perfect blue, Lucius Tarquinius put on royal robes that he had no legal right to wear, called his armed supporters to his side, and walked through the streets of Rome toward the Senate house, ready to claim a throne that had never been offered to him, but which he was determined to take. The forum was already busy when Tarquin arrived, though the hour was still early. Merchants were setting up their stalls, arranging their wares with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this same task 1,000 times before. Lawyers were greeting their clients in the porticos, discussing cases in low voices. Money changers were counting coins, the metallic clink of bronze and silver creating a steady rhythm. The usual business of Rome was beginning its daily cycle, the great machinery of commerce and law grinding into motion as it did every morning. But as Tarquin strode across the paving stones, flanked by men whose swords were barely concealed beneath their cloaks, that rhythm faltered and stopped. People turned to stare. Here was the king's son-in-law, dressed in purple-bordered robes as though he were already king, walking with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do and feared no consequences. Some of those who saw him felt a thrill of excitement. Change was coming, they thought, Finally something new after decades of Servius Tullius's cautious, measured rule. Others felt a chill of fear, recognizing that what they were witnessing was the beginning of a coup, the kind of violent political upheaval that could tear a city apart. Tarquin reached the Curia, the meeting house of the Senate, and without hesitation climbed the steps to the entrance. The guards posted there looked at each other uncertainly. Should they stop him? He was, after all, a member of the royal family, married to the king's daughter, but those robes he wore, that purple trim that marked royalty, he had no right to those, not yet. Still, they hesitated, caught between duty and uncertainty, and in that moment of hesitation, Tarquin passed between them and entered the building, which is really the story of most successful coups when you think about it. They succeed not because the plotters are overwhelmingly powerful, but because the defenders are uncertain, hesitant, unsure whether the old rules still apply or whether new ones have already taken their place. Inside, a few early arriving senators were already present, discussing the day's agenda in quiet voices. They fell silent as Tarquin entered, shocked by his appearance, by the presumption of his dress. Tarquin ignored their stares and walked directly to the curule chair, that ivory throne that symbolized the king's authority, and there, in front of these witnesses, he sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. The senators stared at Tarquin sitting on the king's throne, wearing the king's robes, and tried to process what they were seeing. It was so audacious, so brazen, that it almost defied comprehension. This wasn't how political change was supposed to happen in Rome. There were supposed to be negotiations, discussions, compromises, not this direct seizure of power. "What are you doing?" One of the senators finally found his voice to ask, though it came out weaker than he probably intended. "That is the king's seat." "Yes," Tarquin replied calmly, settling himself more comfortably on the throne. "It is." The simple audacity of the statement left them momentarily speechless. Before anyone could formulate a response, before the shock could wear off enough for someone to actually do something about this situation, Tarquin raised his hand in a prearranged signal. Servants began admitting more people. Senators, patricians, men who Tarquin had carefully cultivated over the years. The Curia filled rapidly with Tarquin's supporters, creating an audience for what would come next, and making any resistance significantly more difficult. When enough men had gathered, when the room was full of faces both friendly and uncertain, Tarquin stood and began to speak. His voice was strong, confident, the voice of a man stating obvious truths rather than advocating a controversial position. "Senators of Rome," he began, and the simple fact that he was addressing them from the throne lent weight to his words. "I come before you today to claim what is rightfully mine. The throne of Rome, held now by Servius Tullius, does not belong to him. It never has. He wears the crown through deception, through the manipulation of my mother Tarquin, through fraud and usurpation. Servius Tullius has ruled Rome for over 40 years, one senator objected, though his voice lacked conviction. He has built our walls, reformed our constitution, conducted the census. He has ruled as a tyrant rules." Tarquin interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut through the objection. "Without the consent of this Senate, without the approval of the people, without even the blessing of the gods, he took power while my father's blood was still warm on the palace floor. He took what belonged by right to me, the son of Tarquinius Priscus, the legitimate heir to the throne. It was a clever argument, mixing legitimate grievances with questionable claims in a way that made it difficult to separate truth from self-serving interpretation. Yes, Servius's accession had been irregular, but so had Tarquinius Priscus's original rise to power, and the idea that the throne automatically passed to the previous king's son was not, strictly speaking, how Roman kingship had ever worked. "And what of your own birth?" another senator asked, perhaps trying to point out this logical flaw. "You speak of legitimacy, but you were not born while your father was king. By your own logic, you have no better claim than Servius." It was a good point, one that might have derailed a less prepared speaker. But Tarquin had anticipated this objection, had prepared for it during his years of planning. "I was born to a man who would become king," he replied smoothly. "I was raised in the palace, groomed for leadership, educated in the arts of war and governance. And more than this, I am of royal Etruscan blood, descended from the princes of Tarquini. Servius Tullius is the son of a slave woman. However capable he may be, however many walls he has built or reforms he has enacted, he is fundamentally unfit to rule Rome. Blood matters, senators, breeding matters, and in this, I am his superior." The argument was calculated to appeal to the aristocratic prejudices of his audience. Many of the patricians in the room had never fully accepted Servius's legitimacy, had always felt vaguely uncomfortable taking orders from a man of such humble origin. Tarquin was offering them a chance to restore what they saw as the natural order of things, to put a man of proper noble blood back on the throne. Several senators nodded. Others looked troubled, but said nothing. The room was dividing, not into clear factions of support and opposition, but into something more complex. Those who agreed, those who disagreed, but were afraid to say so, and those who were simply waiting to see which way the wind would blow before committing themselves. But even as Tarquin spoke, even as some senators nodded agreement while others muttered objections, a messenger burst into the curia, breathless from running. "The king," he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "The king is coming." A hush fell over the assembly. This was it. Then, the confrontation that would determine everything. Would the senators support the old king who had ruled them for 44 years, who had brought them prosperity and security, or would they embrace the ambitious prince who promised a return to traditional values and aristocratic privilege? Servius Tullius entered the curia with all the dignity his 80-plus years could muster. He was dressed simply, as was his custom, but there was something in his bearing that reminded everyone present that this man had ruled Rome for longer than many of them had been alive. He had built the walls that protected them. He had organized the army that defended them. He had created the census that gave them order and structure. Whatever else he was not some minor figure to be casually dismissed. He looked at the crowd of senators, at the armed men standing near the doors, at Tarquin sitting on the royal throne wearing royal robes, and his face hardened with understanding and anger. There was no confusion in his eyes, no surprise. He had been expecting something like this, perhaps, or at least had always known it was possible. The only question had been when. "Tarquin," he said, his voice still strong despite his age. "You sit in my seat." "I sit in my father's seat," Tarquin corrected him, not rising. The deliberate disrespect of remaining seated while addressing the king was not lost on anyone present. "The seat you stole." "I stole nothing," Servius replied, moving closer, his steps slow but steady. "Your mother, Tanaquil, gave me the authority to rule in the emergency following your father's murder. The Senate accepted me. The people embraced me. For 44 years I have served Rome faithfully, asking nothing for myself that I did not also give to the city. And in all those 44 years, Tarquin said, his voice cold, did you ever once ask the Senate formally to grant you the kingship? Did you ever once hold a proper election? Did you ever seek the approval of the auspices, the blessing of the gods?" Servius's face flushed. It was true. He had simply assumed power in the chaos following Priscus's assassination. And by the time anyone might have questioned his authority, he was too firmly established to challenge. It was an irregular succession, however successful the reign that followed. "I have ruled well," Servius said, his voice rising slightly. "The walls of Rome stand because of me. The constitution that protects patrician and plebeian alike exists because of me. The census that brings order to our city is my work. What have you ever done for Rome except scheme and complain? What have I done?" Tarquin rose from the throne now, his voice rising to match Servius's, his carefully controlled demeanor cracking to reveal genuine anger. "I have waited. While a slave's son occupied my birthright, I have watched while you undermined Rome's traditions, elevating the rabble and diminishing the noble. I have endured your presence while you wore a crown you had no right to wear. But I will wait no longer." The two men faced each other across the curia floor, the old king who had ruled longer than anyone in Rome's history, and the ambitious prince who believed that length of service meant nothing compared to the rights of blood. Around them, the senators watched in fascinated horror, knowing that what happened next would shape Rome's future for generations to come. "You want my crown?" Servius said quietly, and there was something in his voice that might have been sadness or resignation, or perhaps just exhaustion. "You want my throne? Then you'll have to take it from me." It might have been intended as a challenge, maybe even an invitation to single combat in the old way, where disputes between men of honor were settled with dignity and witnesses. But Tarquin had not come this far, had not spent so many years planning and scheming to observe the niceties of aristocratic honor. He had come for power, and he would take it however he could. What happened next happened quickly, brutally. Tarquin, a man in his prime, physically attacked Servius, a man in his 80s. There was no dignity in it, no honor, no respect for age or position, or the 4 decades of service had given to Rome. Tarquin simply seized the old king, and using his superior strength, threw him bodily down the steps of the curia. Servius tumbled down the stone steps, his aged body crashing against the hard edges, his bones too old and brittle to withstand such violence. He came to rest at the bottom in a crumpled heap, his purple-bordered toga twisted around him, blood already beginning to flow from cuts on his head and arms. For a moment there was absolute silence in the Curia. Everyone, senators, guards, armed supporters, onlookers, stared in shock at what had just occurred. A king, the sacred ruler of Rome, appointed by the gods to lead their people, had been physically assaulted, cast down like refuse. It was a violation of every tradition, every custom, every notion of what was sacred and inviolable in Roman society, which was, of course, precisely the point. Tarquin had not just claimed the throne, he had shattered the mystique that surrounded it, had demonstrated that kings were just men, mortal and vulnerable, and that power belonged to whoever was strong enough and ruthless enough to take it. In the Curia, Tarquin turned to face the assembled senators. His face was flushed from exertion, his breathing hard, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "I am the King of Rome," he declared. Does anyone dispute this? The silence that followed was answer enough, whether from fear, from shock, from genuine support, or simply from a pragmatic recognition that resistance was futile. No one spoke against him, and so Lucius Tarquinius Superbus became the 7th king of Rome, not through election or divine favour, but through violence and audacity. Outside, on the steps of the Curia, Servius Tullius stirred. He was not dead, not yet, though he was badly injured. Blood flowed from cuts on his head and arms, and he moved with the painful slowness of a man whose body had been pushed far beyond its limits. He managed to get to his hands and knees, then slowly, agonizingly to his feet. People had gathered now, drawn by the commotion, staring at their king, or former king perhaps, in his terrible condition. Some wanted to help, but were afraid to intervene in what was clearly a political matter of the highest importance. Others were simply frozen in shock, unable to process what they were seeing. Servius began to make his way home, staggering through the streets like a wounded animal seeking its den. Every step was agony, but he kept moving, driven perhaps by some instinct to reach safety, to get home to what remained of his family, to die with some measure of dignity rather than in the gutter like a common criminal. Meanwhile, word of Tarquin's coup had reached Tullia. When a servant burst into her chambers with the news, she didn't hesitate for even a moment. "Prepare my carriage," she commanded. "Immediately." "My lady," the servant protested, his face pale with fear. "The streets are full of confusion, there might be violence, it might not be safe." "Now," Tullia demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut through any objection. The servant fled to obey, and within minutes, Tullia was seated in her carriage, ordering her driver to take her to the Forum. She needed to be there, to be the first to greet Tarquin as king, to show the world that she supported what he had done, that she had in fact been part of it from the beginning. Nothing else mattered. Not propriety, not safety, and certainly not the father she had betrayed. Her carriage rattled over the paving stones, her driver urging the horses forward at a pace that was perhaps faster than was entirely safe in the crowded morning streets. They turned a corner, heading toward the Forum along a street that would later be called the Vix Acceleratus, the Street of Crime, though it didn't yet bear that infamous name. And there, staggering in the middle of the street, was Servius Tullius. The driver saw him and pulled the horses to a stop. He turned to Tullia, his face troubled. "My lady, the king is ahead. Should I?" "Drive on," Tullia said, her voice cold. "But my lady, he's injured." "We should," I said. "Drive on." The driver hesitated, frozen between obedience to his mistress and basic human decency. In that moment of hesitation, Tullia leaned forward and struck him with her hand. "Do you serve me, or not? Drive on. Drive over him if you must, but drive on." What happened next would become one of the most infamous moments in all of Roman history. The driver, whether from fear or from some darker impulse, urged the horses forward, and Tullia's carriage, with Tullia herself sitting inside, rolled over the body of Servius Tullius, her own father, the King of Rome. The old king's blood splattered on the wheels, on the sides of the carriage, even on Tullia's robes as she rode past. She didn't flinch, didn't look back, didn't show any sign of remorse or horror. She simply continued on to the Forum, to greet her husband the new king, leaving her father's broken body in the street behind her. The street would be called the Vicus Celeratus forever after, the street of crime, in memory of this terrible act. And Tullia herself would be remembered not as a queen, but as a monster, the woman who literally drove over her father's corpse in her hunger for power. Whether the story is literally true in all its details, or whether it represents a kind of moral truth, a way of expressing just how far Tarquin and Tullia were willing to go for power, is difficult to say. What we know is that Servius Tullius died that day, killed in the coup that brought Tarquin to power, and we know that Tullia supported her husband absolutely, without reservation or regret. She arrived at the forum, dismounted from her blood-stained carriage, and entered the Curia. There she found Tarquin, still surrounded by senators and supporters, still wearing the royal robes he had assumed without permission. "Hail, King of Rome," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. Tarquin smiled and took her hand. Together they stood before the assembled senators, presenting themselves as Rome's new royal couple. Behind them, invisible but certainly present in everyone's mind, was the blood they had spilled to get there. The reign of Tarquinius Superbus had begun, and Rome would never be the same. The first thing Tarquin did as king, well, after the murder and the blood-stained carriage and the formal proclamation of his authority, was nothing at all, which is to say, he didn't convene the Senate to confirm his position. He didn't hold an assembly of the people to seek their approval. He didn't consult the augurs to ensure the gods favoured his rule. He simply acted as though he were already the legitimate king of Rome, and dared anyone to suggest otherwise. This was a radical departure from tradition. Every previous king, even those who had come to power through irregular means, had at least gone through the motions of seeking formal approval. They had presented themselves to the Senate, made speeches about their qualifications, allowed the people to acclaim them, consulted the auspices to ensure divine favour. It was theatre, certainly, but it was important theatre, the kind of ritual that transformed raw power into legitimate authority. Tarquin dispensed with all of it. He had taken the throne through force, and he would hold it through force. The approval of the Senate, the acclaim of the people, the favour of the gods. These were nice to have, perhaps, but not necessary. What was necessary was power, and Tarquin had that. "Shouldn't we at least make a show of consulting the Senate?" one of his advisers asked in those first days, his voice tentative. "It would cost us nothing, and might ease the transition." Tarquin looked at the man as though he had suggested something absurd. "The Senate," he said slowly, "exists to advise the king. I am the king. Why would I need their permission to be what I already am?" "It's not about permission exactly," the advisor tried to explain. "It's about legitimacy, about making the people feel that the people," Tarquin interrupted, "will accept what I tell them to accept, and the Senate will do the same. I didn't fight this hard to claim my throne only to grovel before a collection of old men who would have opposed me if they'd had the courage." It was a revealing statement, one that showed exactly how Tarquin viewed his relationship with Rome's traditional institutions. They were obstacles to be managed, not partners to be consulted, and this attitude would characterize his entire reign. The Senate, of course, noticed this change immediately. For generations they had been accustomed to kings who at least pretended to value their counsel, who invited them to discussions of policy, and sought their input on important decisions. Servius Tullius, whatever his other faults, had been scrupulous about consulting the Senate, about making them feel that they were partners in governing Rome. Tarquin didn't bother. He made decisions alone, announced them as royal decrees, and expected instant obedience. When senators tried to offer advice or suggest alternatives, he would listen with obvious impatience before doing exactly what he had planned to do all along. "Your Majesty," one elderly senator ventured during an early meeting, regarding the proposal to levy a new tax on merchants. "The Senate believes it would be prudent to—" "The tax will be collected starting next month," Tarquin said flatly. "I'm not interested in what the Senate believes. I'm informing you of my decision." The senator blinked in surprise. "But it is customary for the king to at least consider the Senate's recommendations." "I have considered them," Tarquin said, though clearly he hadn't. "And I have made my decision. Was there anything else?" This was not how things were supposed to work. This was not the Roman way, where even kings acknowledged that they ruled with the consent and cooperation of the noble families. But what could the senators do? Tarquin had armed men who were loyal to him personally, not to Rome or its institutions. He had the support of key patrician families who benefited from his policies, and he had demonstrated, quite graphically, what happened to those who opposed him. Speaking of which, not all the senators who had witnessed the coup in the Curia remained in Rome. Some, the ones who had objected most vocally to Tarquin's seizure of power, found it wise to leave the city rather suddenly. They departed for their country estates, claiming concerns about their health or pressing business matters that required their attention elsewhere. Others were not so fortunate. Tarquin moved systematically to eliminate potential opposition, though he was careful to make it seem legal, even necessary. Senators who had been close to Servius Tullius found themselves accused of various crimes: corruption, embezzlement, conspiracy. The evidence was often thin, sometimes non-existent, But it didn't matter. Tarquin was the king, and the king's word was law. One senator, a man named Marcus Genucius, who had served Servius faithfully for decades, found himself summoned to the palace to answer charges of misappropriating public funds. "These accusations are absurd," Genucius protested, standing before Tarquin, in what used to be called a hearing, but was really just a formality before judgment. "I have served Rome honestly for 40 years. Ask anyone who knows me." "I have asked," Tarquin said, examining a scroll that purported to contain evidence of Genucius's crimes. "And the evidence is clear. You have stolen from the Roman treasury." "What evidence? Show me this evidence." Tarquin looked up from the scroll, his expression cold. "Are you calling your king a liar?" It was a trap, of course. If Genucius backed down, he admitted guilt. If he persisted, he was guilty of insulting the king, which was perhaps an even worse crime. "No, your majesty. But surely there has been some mistake." "The only mistake," Tarquin said, "was trusting men like you to handle Rome's wealth. Your property is forfeit to the state. You may leave the city by sunset, or face execution. Choose." Genucius chose exile, as Tarquin knew he would. Within weeks, a dozen other senators had made similar choices, and the Senate was looking considerably more compliant. Those who remained had learned a valuable lesson. Opposition to Tarquin was not a political position to be debated, but a crime to be punished, to ensure his personal safety. Because Tarquin, unlike some tyrants, was not stupid, he surrounded himself with armed bodyguards at all times. This was another break with tradition. Previous Roman kings had moved through the city relatively freely, protected by the respect of their position and the loyalty of their people. They might have guards for ceremonial purposes, but not the kind of heavily armed personal force that Tarquin assembled. These men were not Roman citizens performing a civic duty. They were professional soldiers, loyal to Tarquin personally because he paid them well, and gave them privileges that set them apart from ordinary Romans. They followed him everywhere, hands always on their weapons, eyes always scanning for threats. Their presence sent a clear message. This king did not trust his people, and his people should not forget it. "It's like he's expecting someone to attack him at any moment," one Roman muttered to another as they watched Tarquin's procession pass through the forum, surrounded by armed men. "Well," his companion replied quietly, "given how he became king, can you blame him for being paranoid?" "Careful," the first man said, glancing around nervously. "That kind of talk could get you exiled. Or worse." It was true. Tarquin had informers throughout the city, people who listened for criticism and reported it back to the palace. Not everyone who spoke against the king disappeared, but enough did that people learned to keep their complaints private, shared only with those they trusted absolutely. But Tarquin was not content merely to eliminate opposition and surround himself with guards. He understood that fear alone was not enough to maintain power indefinitely. People also needed to be impressed, to see visible evidence of Roman greatness, to feel that their city was accomplishing great things even under a tyrant's rule. So Tarquin turned his attention to building projects, continuing the work his father had begun decades earlier. The great temple to Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, started by Tarquinius Priscus, still stood incomplete. Tarquin decided to finish it, to make it the greatest temple in all of Italy, a monument that would proclaim Rome's power and piety for generations to come. He threw enormous resources into the project: money, materials, and most controversially, labor. The work was grueling, hauling massive stone blocks up the Capitoline Hill, carving them into shape, positioning them with exact precision. Tarquin didn't rely entirely on volunteers or paid workers. He instituted what amounted to forced labor, compelling Roman citizens to work on the temple, whether they wanted to or not. "It's for the glory of Rome," he would say when people complained. "For the honor of Jupiter himself. Would you refuse to serve the gods?" It was a clever argument, wrapping tyrannical policy in religious necessity. How could you object to working on a temple without seeming to object to the gods themselves? And so Romans labored on the Capitoline, sweating under the summer sun, their hands bleeding from the rough stone, building a monument to divine glory that also happened to be a monument to Tarquin's ambition. The ancient sources tell us that the work was so onerous, so exhausting and endless, that some workers preferred death to continuing. They tell stories of men who threw themselves from the scaffolding rather than face another day of forced labor, their bodies broken on the rocks below. Whether these stories are literally true, or represent a kind of metaphorical truth about the oppressiveness of Tarquin's rule, is difficult to say. What's clear is that the temple rose, slowly but steadily, becoming the architectural centerpiece of Rome. But buildings alone were not enough. Tarquin, like his father before him, understood that Rome's greatness would ultimately be measured not in stone but in power, political, military, economic power over the surrounding region, and so he turned his attention to conquest. The Latin peoples who surrounded Rome had long been wary of the growing city on the Tiber. Some were allies, bound by treaty and mutual interest. Others were rivals, competing for the same resources and territory. Tarquin set about systematically bringing them all under Roman control, using a combination of military force, political manipulation, and strategic marriages. He was, it must be said, good at warfare. Whatever else might be said about Tarquin, his cruelty, his contempt for Roman institutions, his tyrannical methods, he was an effective military commander. He understood strategy, logistics, the importance of intelligence and preparation. His campaigns against the Latin cities were models of efficiency. The city of Gabii, one of Rome's most powerful neighbours, proved particularly troublesome. It was well fortified, well governed, and had no intention of submitting to Roman authority. Tarquin tried direct assault, and was repulsed. He tried siege, and found the city too well supplied to starve, so he tried something more creative. He had a son, Sextus Tarquinius, who was perhaps even more ruthless than his father, if such a thing were possible. Tarquinius sent Sextus to Gabii with instructions to pretend he had fled Rome after being beaten and abused by his cruel father. The wounds were real. Tarquin had actually beaten his own son to make the deception more convincing, which tells you something about the family dynamic, which really makes you wonder about the dinner conversations in the Tarquin household. "Pass the wine, father." "Certainly, son. And by the way, tomorrow I'm going to beat you bloody so you can infiltrate our enemies and betray them from within." "Sounds good, father. Can I have the bread?" Sextus arrived in Gabii, bloodied and desperate, claiming to be a victim of his father's tyranny. The people of Gabii, knowing Tarquin's reputation, believed him. They took him in, gave him shelter, and eventually, impressed by his apparent abilities and his knowledge of Roman military tactics, gave him positions of increasing authority. Sextus spent months, perhaps years, gaining their trust, working his way into the confidence of Gabii's leaders. And then, when the moment was right, when he had access to the city's defences and knowledge of its weaknesses, he sent a message to his father. The message was cryptic. Tarquin had taught his son to be careful with written communication. It simply asked, "What should I do next?" Tarquin's response was more cryptic still. He didn't send a written reply. Instead, he took the messenger into his private garden and walked among the poppies growing there. As he walked, he used his staff to strike off the heads of the tallest poppies, saying nothing, just systematically removing the flowers that stood highest above their fellows. The messenger returned to Gabii and described what he had seen. Sextus understood immediately. His father was telling him to eliminate Gabii's leaders, to remove the men who stood tallest in the city, to create chaos and confusion that Rome could then exploit. And that's exactly what Sextus did. He accused leading citizens of various crimes, had them executed or exiled, eliminated anyone who might organize effective resistance. And when Gabii was sufficiently weakened, sufficiently divided against itself, he simply opened the gates to Roman forces. Gabii fell without a battle, betrayed from within by a man they had trusted. It was a brilliant piece of strategy, ruthless and effective. It was also deeply dishonorable by traditional Roman standards, the kind of deception that earlier Romans would have considered beneath them. But Tarquin didn't care about honor. He cared about results. With Gabii under his control, other Latin cities began to reconsider their positions. Some submitted voluntarily, preferring negotiated terms to the kind of treachery that had destroyed Gabii. Others tried to form alliances to resist Rome, but Tarquin was skilled at breaking such coalitions apart, offering favourable terms to some while threatening others, until the alliance collapsed into recriminations and mutual suspicion. Within a few years of taking power, Tarquin had made Rome the dominant force in Latium. The surrounding cities paid tribute, sent soldiers when Rome demanded them, deferred to Roman authority in disputes. It was an impressive achievement, one that expanded Rome's power and prestige far beyond what it had been under Servius Tullius. But there was a cost to these successes, a price paid by the Roman people themselves. The constant warfare required constant taxation to pay for armies and equipment. The building projects demanded labour that took men away from their farms and businesses. The expansion of Roman power made Tarquin more secure in his position, but did not necessarily make ordinary Romans more prosperous or secure in theirs, and all the while, the gap between Tarquin and the Senate continued to widen. He didn't just ignore their advice. He actively worked to diminish their power and prestige. When senators died, he didn't always appoint replacements, allowing the Senate's numbers to dwindle. When he did make appointments, he chose men known for their loyalty to him personally, rather than for their wisdom or standing in the community. The Senate sessions, when they were held at all, became empty rituals. Tarquin would announce decisions he had already made, allow perfunctory discussion that he clearly wasn't listening to, and then move on to the next item of business. The senators sat in their curial chairs, wore their purple-bordered togas, and maintained the appearances of dignity and authority. But everyone knew the truth. They had become decorative, ceremonial, powerless. "We are props," one senator muttered to another, after a particularly pointless meeting. "Scenery in a play where only one actor matters." "At least props are safe," his colleague replied. "As long as we sit quietly and say nothing important, we keep our property and our heads. There are worse fates." It was a sad commentary on how far Rome had fallen from the ideals of shared governance that had characterized earlier reigns. But it was also realistic. The senators who survived were the ones who understood that their role had changed, that they were no longer advisors to the king, but subjects of a tyrant. And Tarquin, secure in his power, surrounded by guards, successful in warfare, and acclaimed however reluctantly by his people, seemed unstoppable. He had seized the throne through violence and held it through fear and force. He had broken the Senate, eliminated his enemies, and expanded Rome's territory. By any measure of raw power, he was enormously successful. But success and legitimacy are not the same thing. And the resentment he created, the traditions he violated, the institutions he diminished, these were seeds that would eventually grow into something that even Tarquin's guards and armies could not suppress. For now, though, in these early years of his reign, Tarquinius Superbus ruled Rome absolutely, a king in fact, and in name, answerable to no one, constrained by nothing except the limits of his own ambition, which, as it turned out, had no limits at all. Years passed, and Tarquin's reign settled into a kind of terrible normalcy. Romans grew accustomed to their king's methods, to the constant presence of armed guards, to the forced labour on public works, to the wars that seemed to come every summer as regularly as the harvest. It wasn't that they liked these things exactly. It was more that they learnt to live with them, the way you learn to live with a chronic ailment that's painful but not quite fatal. The temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill continued to rise, and Tarquin pushed the work forward with relentless determination. He brought in Etruscan craftsmen, specialists in the kind of monumental architecture that Rome was still learning to master. These were men from cities like Veii and Tarquin Clay, places where temples had been built for centuries, where the techniques of working with massive stone blocks and creating the elaborate terracotta decorations that adorned such buildings had been refined to high art. The chief architect was a man named Volker, brought from Veni at enormous expense. He was a master craftsman capable of creating the kind of sculptural decorations that would make the temple not just large but magnificent. Under his direction, workshops sprang up around the base of the Capitoline, where artisans carved and painted the terracotta figures that would adorn the roof and pediments. "It must be the greatest temple in Italy," Tarquin told Volker during one of his frequent inspections of the work. "I want anyone who sees it to understand immediately that Rome is superior to every other city, that our gods are honoured more magnificently than theirs." "It will be, Your Majesty," Volker assured him, gesturing to the rising structure. "The central cellar will house Jupiter, with Juno and Minerva in flanking chambers. The terracotta quadriga on the roof peak will be visible from miles away. No temple in Etruria, no temple anywhere, will match it." Tarquin nodded, satisfied. This was the kind of visible, permanent achievement that would outlast any individual reign. Long after he was gone, this temple would stand on the Capitoline, proclaiming Rome's greatness, and, not coincidentally, the greatness of the king who had completed it. Of course, someone had to pay for all this magnificence. The Etruscan craftsmen didn't work for free, and the materials, the stone blocks, the timber for scaffolding, the clay for the terracotta decorations, the gold and ivory for the cult statue, all of this cost money, enormous amounts of money. Tarquin paid for it through a combination of taxation, tribute from conquered cities, and what can only be called creative appropriation of resources. When he needed funds, he would discover that some wealthy citizen had committed a crime, usually something conveniently vague like disrespecting the king or working against Rome's interests. The citizen's property would be confiscated, and a substantial portion of it would find its way into the temple-building fund. "It's remarkable," one Roman merchant observed to another, speaking quietly in the back of a tavern where he hoped no informers were listening, "how many criminals Tarquin discovers just when the temple needs more funding." "Remarkable indeed," his companion agreed, keeping his voice equally low. "And how these criminals always seem to be men with substantial property." You never hear about poor criminals having their assets seized for the temple fund. Perhaps the gods only care about crimes committed by the wealthy, the first merchant suggested, and they both laughed quietly, bitterly, at the absurdity of their situation. But the temple did rise, undeniably impressive, undeniably magnificent. Whatever you thought about Tarquin's methods, you had to admit that the result was spectacular. The building dominated the Capitoline Hill, visible from throughout the city, a constant reminder of Roman power and piety, or tyranny and extravagance depending on your perspective. Tarquin also turned his attention to Rome's infrastructure in more practical ways. He completed the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system that his father had begun. This was less glamorous than a temple, but arguably more important for daily life. The sewer drained the marshy areas of the Forum and surrounding valleys, making them usable for building and commerce. It was an engineering marvel, a massive stone-lined channel that carried waste and floodwater down to the Tiber. The work was brutal, perhaps even more so than the temple construction. Workers had to dig deep trenches, line them with stone in conditions that were dark, damp and dangerous. Cave-ins were common. Men died in the tunnels, buried under collapsed earth or drowned when water broke through unexpectedly. But the work continued, driven by Tarquin's determination to transform Rome into a city that could rival the great Etruscan centres. Your father began this work, Tullia would remind him when he grew frustrated with the slow pace of construction. You will complete it. That's the legacy you're building. Not just what you create yourself, but what you finish that he started. It was one of the few times Tullia spoke of legacy, of anything beyond the immediate exercise of power. She had gotten what she wanted. She was Queen of Rome, wife to the king, the most powerful woman in the city. But power, once achieved, has to be maintained, and Tullia understood that as well as her husband did. She held court in the palace, receiving the wives of senators and other important men, maintaining the social networks that complemented Tarquin's political control. Where Tarquin used fear and force, Tullia used social pressure and the subtle hierarchies of Roman feminine society. Women who wanted their husbands to advance in status needed Tullia's favour. Women who offended her found themselves frozen out of important social gatherings, their families' marriage prospects diminishing, their influence waning. "I hear your daughter is of marriageable age," Tullia would say to a senator's wife, her voice pleasant but her eyes calculating. "Such a lovely girl. I'm sure you'll have no trouble finding her a suitable match, assuming, of course, that your husband continues to demonstrate his loyalty to the king." It was a threat wrapped in social pleasantry, the kind of thing that couldn't be directly challenged, but was unmistakable in its meaning. Tullia had driven over her father's corpse to become queen. Did anyone really think she would hesitate to destroy a senator's family prospects to maintain her position? Tarquin and Tullia had 3 sons, Titus, Arruns, and Sextus. The boys grew up in the palace, learning from their parents' example what power meant and how it should be exercised, which is to say, they learned lessons that would have horrified earlier generations of Romans. Titus, the eldest, was perhaps the most like his father, calculating, ambitious, willing to use whatever methods achieved results. Arruns was quieter, more thoughtful, though whether this represented genuine difference in temperament or simply a different approach to achieving the same goals was hard to say. And Sextus, the youngest, combined his father's ruthlessness with an additional streak of cruelty and entitlement that made him dangerous in ways that went beyond mere political ambition. "Your sons will continue your work when you're gone," Tullia told Tarquin one evening, watching the 3 boys practice swordplay in the palace courtyard. "They understand power. They won't make the mistakes of weak kings who try to please everyone." "No," Tarquin agreed, though there was something in his voice that might have been doubt. "They won't make those mistakes." What he didn't say, what perhaps he didn't let himself think, was whether his sons might make different mistakes, whether he was creating a dynasty that would hold Rome forever, or simply training the men who would eventually destroy what he had built. Meanwhile, Rome's power continued to expand. Tarquin launched campaigns against the Volsci, a people who controlled territory south of Rome. The wars were brutal, characterized by the kind of total warfare that left conquered cities depopulated and their fields burned. Tarquin didn't believe in gentle conquests or magnanimous treatment of defeated enemies. He believed in making examples, in ensuring that other cities understood the cost of resisting Rome. The city of Suessa fell after a long siege. Tarquin ordered the city sacked, its wealth distributed among his soldiers, its people sold into slavery. The ruins stood as a warning to other Volscian cities. This is what happens when you resist Rome. Was it necessary to be quite so thorough? One of his generals asked, surveying the smoking ruins. We could have extracted tribute, made them allies. I don't want allies, Tarquin interrupted. I want subjects. I want other cities to look at Suessa Pometia and understand that resistance is futile and submission is survival. Fear is more reliable than friendship. It was a philosophy that worked, at least in the short term. Other Volscian cities surrendered rather than face Suessa Pometia's fate. Tarquin's reputation for ruthlessness became a weapon in itself, one that won battles before they were fought. He also involved himself in the complex politics of the Latin League, the confederation of Latin cities that had long been organized around shared ethnicity and mutual defense. Tarquin maneuvered to make himself the dominant figure in the League, not through election or consensus, but through a combination of military threat and political manipulation. At one gathering of the Latin leaders, a meeting held at a sacred grove where the cities had assembled for generations, Tarquin simply announced that he would be directing the League's military policy from now on. By what right? Demanded Turnus Herdonius, a leader from Aricia and one of the few men willing to speak against Tarquin directly. The League operates by consensus. No single city, no single man has the authority you're claiming. I have the authority of power, Tarquin replied calmly. Rome is the strongest city in Latium. Our army is the largest, our resources the greatest. It makes sense for the strongest to lead, unless you'd prefer to test your strength against mine. It was a naked threat, and everyone knew it. Turnus Herdonius knew it too, but he was either braver or more foolish than most. This is tyranny, he declared. The other cities will not accept. He didn't finish the sentence. That night, Turnus Herdonius was found dead in his tent, killed by unknown assailants. Tarquin expressed shock and outrage at this terrible crime, promised to find the perpetrators, and suggested that the League postpone any further discussion of leadership until this tragic matter was resolved. The investigation, predictably, went nowhere, and the other Latin leaders, understanding the implicit message, accepted Tarquin's leadership without further protest. It was easier than dying in their tents. Back in Rome, the Senate had dwindled to perhaps half its original size. Some senators had died of natural causes and not been replaced. Others had been exiled or executed for various alleged crimes. Still others had simply left Rome, preferring quiet obscurity in the countryside to the dangerous game of pretending to advise a king who didn't want advice. Those who remained had learned to be very, very careful. They arrived at Senate meetings, listened to Tarquin's announcements, voted approval of whatever he proposed, and went home. It was a thoroughly degraded institution, a shadow of what it had been under previous kings. Do you remember, one elderly senator said to another as they walked home from a particularly pointless meeting, when the Senate actually debated things, when we discussed policy and the king listened? I remember, his companion replied. I also remember what happened to senators who tried to maintain that tradition under Tarquin. Some traditions aren't worth dying for. No, the first senator agreed sadly. I suppose they're not, but not everyone had given up entirely. In private houses, in quiet conversations, in the kind of discussions that could never be held in public, some Romans began to talk about alternatives. Nothing so definite as a plot or conspiracy. That would have been far too dangerous. But questions were asked, hypotheticals discussed, possibilities explored. What if, someone might ask in a very quiet voice, what if Rome didn't have a king at all? What do you mean? Another would reply, genuinely confused. Rome has always had kings. 7 kings, going back to Romulus himself. What else would we have? I don't know, the first person would admit. But there are cities in Greece, I've heard, that govern themselves differently. Elected officials, rotating leadership, that sort of thing. That's madness. Someone else would object. How can a city function without a single leader? You'd have chaos, endless disputes, nothing would ever get decided. As opposed to the perfect order we have now, the first person would say dryly, where everything gets decided by one man who doesn't listen to anyone, and who kills or exiles anyone who disagrees with him. These were dangerous conversations, the kind that could get you executed if the wrong person overheard, but they happened nonetheless, quietly, carefully, among people who were beginning to imagine that there might be alternatives to monarchy, even if they couldn't quite envision what those alternatives would look like. Tarquin, if he knew about these quiet discussions, and his network of informers probably told him something about them, didn't seem particularly worried. He had the army, he had loyal guards, he had the support of enough patrician families that any opposition would be fractured and ineffective. He had conquered most of the surrounding territory, making Rome the dominant power in Latium. He had completed magnificent building projects that proclaimed Rome's greatness. What did he care if some malcontents muttered in their cups about alternative forms of government? Let them talk. Talk was harmless. Action was dangerous, and Tarquin had made sure that anyone contemplating action understood the consequences. Standing on the Capitoline Hill one evening, looking out over the city as the sun set, Tarquin felt something close to satisfaction. The temple behind him was nearing completion, its terracotta decorations gleaming in the fading light. The city below sprawled across the 7 hills, larger and more prosperous than it had been when he took power. The surrounding territory paid tribute to Rome, acknowledged Roman supremacy. He had done what he set out to do. He had claimed his father's legacy, had taken the throne that should have been his from the beginning, had made Rome greater than it had ever been. History would remember him, he was certain. Perhaps not fondly, but that didn't matter. What mattered was being remembered, being significant, being the kind of king whose reign changed everything. What Tarquin didn't know, couldn't know, was that his greatest achievements were also creating the conditions for his greatest failure. The forced labour that built his monuments had created resentment. The wars that expanded Roman power had created military veterans who understood that kings were just men, mortal and vulnerable. The Senate he had degraded retained its institutional memory of a time when it had real power, and the traditions he had violated, the customs of consultation, the rituals of legitimacy, the respect for law and precedent, these had not disappeared just because he ignored them. They had gone underground into those quiet conversations in private houses, into the stories fathers told their sons about how Rome used to be governed, into a growing sense that Tarquin's reign was an aberration rather than the new normal. But for now, in this moment, standing on the Capitoline as darkness fell over Rome, Tarquinius Superbus was at the height of his power, the 7th king of Rome, conqueror of the Latins, builder of monuments, master of the Senate, feared and obeyed by all. It wouldn't last. But he didn't know that yet. In the 25th year of Tarquin's reign, Rome went to war with the city of Ardea. This was not particularly unusual. Tarquin went to war with someone almost every year, as regularly as other people observed religious festivals. What made this campaign different was not the war itself, but what happened during it, the events that would unfold in a military camp and in a quiet house in the town of Calacia, events that would change the course of Roman history. Ardea was a wealthy city, prosperous from trade, with defences strong enough that it couldn't be taken by direct assault. So Tarquin settled in for a siege, surrounding the city with Roman forces and preparing to wait out the defenders. It was the kind of siege that could take months, even years, and sieges have a particular quality to them. Long periods of boredom punctuated by brief moments of terror, with soldiers sitting around camp with too much time to think and not enough useful work to do, which, historically speaking, has always been a recipe for trouble. Among the young officers in Tarquin's army were his sons, Titus, Arruns, and Sextus, along with various nobles and their relatives who made up the officer class of the Roman army. One of these was a man named Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, a relative of the king who governed the town of Collatia. Another was Lucius Junius Brutus, a man with an interesting history. Brutus was the son of Tarquin's sister, which made him the king's nephew. But his father and older brother had both been killed by Tarquin in the early years of his reign, their property confiscated under some pretext or another. Young Brutus had survived by adopting a persona of stupidity, playing the fool so thoroughly that Tarquin dismissed him as harmless. The name Brutus actually meant dullard or stupid, and Lucius Junius had embraced it, using it like a shield. Better to be thought a fool and live, he had apparently decided, than to be thought clever and end up dead like his father and brother. So Brutus spent his days playing the buffoon, saying stupid things, making poor decisions in small matters, generally convincing everyone that he was harmless because he was too dim-witted to be dangerous. Whether this was genuine or an incredibly maintained act of self-preservation, no one knew for certain, but it kept him alive, which was more than could be said for most people who had reason to oppose Tarquin. One evening, as the siege dragged on and the officers sat around drinking wine in one of the command tents, the conversation turned, as it often did among young men far from home, to the subject of wives. "My wife," Sextus Tarquinius announced, refilling his cup, "is probably at some banquet or gathering in Rome, enjoying herself while I sit here in the mud watching Ardeans walk around on their walls. At least she's enjoying herself in Rome." Another officer laughed. "Mine is probably complaining about my absence to anyone who will listen, and spending my money on things we don't need." "All wives spend money we don't need," someone else contributed. "That's what wives do." The conversation continued in this vein for a while. each man either praising or complaining about his wife, depending on his temperament and how much wine he'd consumed, until Collatinus spoke up. "My wife," he said quietly, "is Lucretia, and while we sit here drinking and talking, she's at home in Colotatia, probably working at her loom and managing the household. She doesn't need me to be there for her to be virtuous and industrious." There was something in the way he said it, a quiet pride, that cut through the drunken boasting. Sextus looked at his cousin with something that might have been amusement, or might have been something darker. "You're very confident of that," Sextus observed. "How do you know she's not like the others, enjoying her freedom while her husband is away?" "I know my wife," Collatinus said simply. "But do you?" Another officer interjected, warming to the debate. "How can any man truly know what his wife does when he's not there? We'd all like to think our wives are virtuous, but knowing it is different from hoping it." An idea began to form. The kind of idea that seems brilliant when you're drinking but is actually quite stupid. Someone, the sources disagree on who exactly, suggested a test. "Why don't we go and see this person?" suggested. "We're only a few hours' ride from Rome. We could go to the city right now, unannounced, and see what our wives are actually doing. Then we'd know for certain." It was a ridiculous proposal, the kind of thing you suggest as a joke. But the young officers, bored and restless and drunk enough to think this was entertainment rather than foolishness, embraced it enthusiastically. "Yes," Sextus agreed immediately. "Let's do it. We'll ride to Rome tonight, see what our wives are doing, and settle this question once and for all." And so, in an example of the kind of decision-making that has characterized young men throughout history, they did exactly that. A group of officers from the siege of Ardea mounted their horses and rode through the night toward Rome, expecting to catch their wives in various states of misbehavior and thoroughly enjoying the prospect of being proven right about feminine frivolity. They arrived in Rome as evening was settling over the city, and went first to the royal palace, where Sextus's brothers' wives were living. They found exactly what Sextus had predicted. The women were hosting a banquet, dressed in their finest clothes, surrounded by friends and guests, clearly enjoying themselves in their husband's absence. "See," Sextus said to Collatinus, "this is what wives do. They entertain themselves while we work and fight. You haven't seen my wife yet." Collatinus replied evenly. So they rode on to Calatia, to Collatinus's house, arriving late in the evening, and there they found Lucretia, exactly as Collatinus had described, sitting with her household servants, working at her loom by lamplight, her mind clearly on domestic matters rather than entertainment. She looked up in surprise when her husband entered, followed by this group of young officers, all of them still dusty from their ride. "Lucius," she exclaimed, setting down her work and rising to greet him. "I wasn't expecting you. Is something wrong? Has something happened at Ardea?" "Nothing's wrong," Collatinus assured her, embracing his wife. "We were having a discussion about what our wives might be doing in our absence, and I wagered that you would be here, working, being the perfect Roman matron. And I was right." Lucretia smiled, though she seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention. "Well, of course I'm here. Where else would I be? The household doesn't run itself." She welcomed the unexpected guests, called for servants to bring food and wine, and set about being a good hostess despite the late hour and lack of warning. She was, by all accounts, beautiful, virtuous, competent. Exactly the kind of wife that Roman moralists would later hold up as the ideal of feminine virtue. And Sextus Tarquinius, watching her move about the house, seeing the way she carried herself, the combination of beauty and dignity and capability, felt something stir in him, something dark and possessive, and entirely inappropriate, given that this was his cousin's wife. The officers stayed for a meal, talked for a while, and then rode back to the siege at Ardea, their ridiculous expedition completed. Collatinus had won his wager. His wife was exactly as virtuous as he had claimed. Everyone laughed about it, teased him good-naturedly about being boring and predictable, and the incident seemed to end there. But it hadn't ended. Not for Sextus. Over the following days and weeks as the siege of Ardea continued its slow, grinding course, Sextus couldn't stop thinking about Lucretia. He told himself it was simple attraction, nothing serious, the kind of idle fantasy that meant nothing. But it was more than that. There was something about the fact that she belonged to someone else, that she was virtuous and faithful and therefore theoretically unattainable, that made him want her more. Sextus Tarquinius had grown up as the son of a king, as royalty who could have almost anything he wanted. He had been raised by parents who taught him that power meant taking what you desired, and that other people's rules didn't apply to you. He had watched his father seize a throne through murder, and his mother drive over her own father's corpse in her carriage. Restraint, respect for boundaries, consideration for others' rights. These were not concepts that had featured prominently in his education. So when Sextus wanted something, he took it. And what he wanted now was Lucretia. A few days later, Sextus left the camp at Ardea, telling people he had business to attend to. He rode to Collatia, arriving at Collatinus's house in the evening. Collatinus was still at the siege, of course, but Sextus was family, a prince of Rome, the king's son. Of course he was welcomed into the house. Lucretia received him courteously, had servants prepare a meal, made up a guest room for him. She was a good hostess, treating her husband's cousin and the king's son with the respect his position demanded. There was nothing inappropriate in her behavior, nothing that suggested anything other than proper hospitality. They ate dinner together, making polite conversation. Lucretia asked about the siege, about how her husband was doing. Sextus answered her questions, all the while watching her, planning. "Your husband speaks highly of you," Sextus said at one point. "He was very proud when he described your virtue to us." "He's a good man," Lucretia replied. "I'm fortunate to have married him." "Fortunate indeed," Sextus agreed, and something in his tone made Lucretia glance at him sharply, but she said nothing. Eventually the evening ended. Lucretia showed Sextus to his guest room, wished him good night, and retired to her own chambers. The household settled into sleep. Servants in their quarters, Lucretia in her room, everyone assuming that the king's son was safely in bed in the guest chamber. But Sextus didn't sleep. He waited until he was certain everyone else was asleep, until the house was quiet and dark. Then he rose, drew his sword for what he was about to do, and made his way through the house to Lucretia's room. What happened next is one of the most infamous events in Roman history, told and retold across the centuries, analysed by historians and moralists and poets. The basic facts are these. Sextus Tarquinius entered Lucretia's room, woke her with his hand over her mouth, and threatened her with his sword. "If you scream," he told her, his voice low, "I'll kill you, and one of your male slaves, put you both in bed together, and tell everyone I caught you in adultery and killed you for it. Your reputation will be destroyed forever, and everyone will believe me, because I'm the king's son. Or you can submit to me quietly, and no one ever needs to know." It was a vicious piece of manipulation, exploiting Lucretia's concern for her reputation and her family's honor. In Roman society, a woman's reputation was everything. Even the victim of rape could be seen as dishonored, her family shamed, and Sextus knew this, used it as a weapon as surely as the sword in his hand. Lucretia, trapped between violence and disgrace, between certain death and certain dishonor, made the choice that Sextus knew she would make. She submitted, not because she wanted to, not because she consented, but because the alternative Sextus presented was even worse. And then Sextus left, riding back to the siege of Ardea, probably feeling quite pleased with himself, certainly not understanding what he had just set in motion. Lucretia waited until morning, until her household was awake and going about its daily business. Then she sent urgent messages to her father Spurius Lucretius in Rome, and to her husband at Ardea. The messages were simple. "Come immediately. Something terrible has happened. Bring trusted friends." Both men came as quickly as they could. Collatinus brought with him his friend Lucius Junius Brutus, that nephew of the king who everyone thought was stupid. Spurius Lucretius brought Publius Valerius, another nobleman of good family. They arrived at the house in Collatia to find Lucretia waiting for them, her demeanor calm but her eyes suggesting someone who had made a terrible decision and was now preparing to see it through. "What's happened?" Collatinus asked immediately, going to his wife. "Your message said something terrible. Are you hurt? Is someone threatening you? I need you to promise me something first." Lucretia said, her voice steady. "All of you. I need you to promise that you will avenge what has been done to me." "Of course," her father said immediately. "Whatever it is, we'll make it right. But tell us what happened." So Lucretia told them. She described Sextus's visit, his attack, the impossible choice he had given her. She told them everything, her voice never wavering, her manner composed despite the horror of what she was describing. "I was left with no choice," she concluded. "I could submit, or I could die in disgrace with my reputation destroyed. So I submitted to save my honor, or at least to prevent the dishonor he threatened me with. But I cannot live with this. A woman who has been violated, even against her will, is dishonored, and I will not live dishonored." "You were the victim," Collatinus said, his voice breaking. "You did nothing wrong. The dishonor is his, not yours." "Perhaps," Lucretia said. But others will not see it that way. Some will always wonder if I could have resisted more, if I encouraged him somehow, if I'm lying about it being against my will. I know how people talk. I know how the world judges women, and I will not spend the rest of my life under that shadow, with people whispering about me, questioning my virtue. We'll kill him, Collatinus vowed. We'll make him pay for this. Yes, Lucretia agreed. You will. But first, she drew a knife that she had concealed in her robes. Before anyone could stop her, before anyone fully understood what she was about to do, she plunged it into her own heart. Tell everyone, she gasped as she fell, her husband catching her, her father crying out in horror. Tell everyone what the king's son did. Tell them, and then she died. Her blood pooling on the floor of her own home, her body held by a husband who had failed to protect her, and a father who had failed to save her. For a long moment, no one moved. They all stood frozen, staring at Lucretia's body, trying to process what had just happened. This virtuous woman, this perfect Roman matron, had chosen death over dishonor. She had made herself a symbol, a martyr, a rallying point for every grievance against the Tarquins. And then Brutus spoke. Brutus, who everyone thought was stupid, who had spent years playing the fool to survive, he pulled the bloody knife from Lucretia's body and held it up. By this blood, he said, his voice clear and strong, and not at all stupid, most pure before the outrage of the king's son, I swear before you, Jupiter, and before all the gods, that I will drive hence Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, together with his cursed wife and all his children, by sword, by fire, by whatever means I can, and I will not suffer them or anyone else to reign in Rome. It was the voice of a man who had been waiting years for this moment, who had played the fool while planning revenge for his murdered father and brother, who had been biding his time until the right opportunity presented itself. And that opportunity had just been handed to him, written in Lucretia's blood on the floor of a house in Colasia. The mask of stupidity had fallen away. Lucius Junius Brutus, the supposed dullard, was revealed as a man of intelligence, passion, and deadly purpose, and he had just declared war on the King of Rome. The other men in the room stared at Brutus as though seeing him for the first time, which, in a sense, they were. The fumbling fool they thought they knew had vanished, replaced by someone whose eyes burned with years of suppressed rage, and whose voice carried the weight of absolute conviction. Collatinus was the first to move. He took the knife from Brutus's hand and repeated the oath, his voice choked with grief and fury. Then Lucretia's father, his face wet with tears. Then Publius Valerius. One by one they swore to drive the Tarquins from Rome, to end the monarchy, to avenge what had been done to Lucretia. But we're 4 men, Valerius said practically, once the oaths were complete. 4 men against a king who has an army, guards, informers throughout the city. How do we? We start by showing the people what the Tarquins truly are, Brutus interrupted, his mind clearly already working on a plan. We take Lucretia's body to Rome. We display it in the forum. We tell everyone what Sextus did, not quietly, not in whispers, but publicly, loudly, so that everyone in Rome knows that this is what happens when you give absolute power to men without virtue. They'll arrest us. Collatinus objected. The moment we start speaking against the royal family, Tarquin's guards will what? Brutus asked. Kill us in the forum in front of everyone. That would only prove our point. No, they'll hesitate, and in that hesitation, we'll have time to make the people understand what's at stake. It was a gamble, but it was the only gamble they had. So they prepared Lucretia's body, laying it on a bier with the bloody knife placed beside her so everyone could see how she had died. Then they carried her out of the house in Coloe and began the journey to Rome. Word spread ahead of them. People came out of their houses to see what was happening, saw the body of Lucretia, saw the grim faces of the men carrying her, and began to follow. By the time they reached Rome, they had a crowd with them, hundreds of people wanting to know what had happened, why this virtuous woman was being carried through the streets like a fallen warrior. They brought her to the Forum, that great public space that Tarquin's grandfather had created, and there they set down the bier in full view of everyone. People gathered, curious and concerned, a crowd swelling to fill the Forum, as news spread that something important was happening. Brutus climbed onto the rostra, the speaker's platform, and looked out at the assembled Romans. These were his people, the citizens he had watched suffer under Tarquin's rule for years, while he played the fool and survived. Now, finally, he could speak the truth. Romans, he called out, his voice carrying across the Forum. Look at what lies before you. This is Lucretia, daughter of Spurius Lucretius, wife of Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. She was virtuous. She was faithful. She was everything a Roman woman should be. And she is dead by her own hand because Sextus Tarquinius, son of your king, raped her. A murmur ran through the crowd, shock and anger mixing together. Brutus continued, not giving them time to process, driving his point home. He came to her house as a guest. She welcomed him with hospitality, and he repaid that hospitality by threatening her with death and dishonor unless she submitted to him. She chose to live so she could tell us what happened, and then she chose to die rather than live with the shame of what he had done to her. He gestured to the body, to the bloody knife. This is what the Tarquins think of you. This is how they treat your wives, your daughters, your families. They take what they want without regard for law, for custom, for decency. Sextus Tarquinius raped Lucretia. His father Tarquinius Superbus murdered Servius Tullius to steal the throne. His mother Tullia drove her carriage over her own father's body. This family has no respect for anything except their own power and their own desires. The crowd was listening now, really listening. Some were nodding, others looked angry, still others seemed frightened by what they were hearing. But they were all paying attention. How many of you have laboured on the king's building projects against your will? Brutus asked. How many have seen your property seized on false charges? How many have watched as the Senate, which should represent you and advise your leaders, has been reduced to a collection of frightened men who approve whatever the king demands? How many of you have lived in fear, watching your words, afraid that saying the wrong thing might get you exiled or killed? He could see people in the crowd nodding, recognizing their own experiences in his words. Good. That was what he needed. Rome was founded by free men, Brutus declared. Free men who chose Romulus as their king, who elected each king that followed, who gave their consent to be governed. But Tarquin did not ask for your consent. He seized power through murder. He rules through fear. He respects no law except his own will. This is not kingship. This is tyranny. The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Tyranny. It was a word borrowed from the Greeks, describing rulers who held power illegitimately, who governed for their own benefit rather than the common good. It was the worst thing you could call a ruler, an indictment not just of their methods but of their fundamental right to rule. I say we end this tyranny, Brutus continued, his voice rising. I say we drive the Tarquins from Rome. I say we declare that never again will Rome be ruled by a king. Let us govern ourselves, elect our own leaders, make our own laws. Let us be free men again. It was a radical proposal, almost incomprehensible to people who had known nothing but monarchy their entire lives. Rome had always had kings, going back to Romulus himself. The idea of Rome without a king was like the idea of Rome without the 7 hills. It seemed to contradict the fundamental nature of what Rome was. But the crowd was angry. They were looking at Lucretia's body, thinking about their own forced labour, their confiscated property, their diminished senate, their lives lived in fear, and Brutus was offering them an alternative, a way out, a chance to be something other than subjects of a tyrant. Who's with me? Brutus shouted. Who will swear to drive the Tarquins out and make Rome free? For a moment there was silence. This was the crucial point, the moment where the revolution could succeed or fail. If the crowd rejected Brutus's call, if they chose to remain loyal to the established order out of fear or habit or simple conservatism, then this would all end badly for the conspirators. But then someone in the crowd raised his hand and shouted, I'm with you, then another, then a dozen, then hundreds. The crowd was transforming from a collection of individuals into something unified and powerful, a mob with a purpose, citizens becoming revolutionaries. Brutus pointed toward the Palatine Hill, where the royal palace stood. Then let us go to the palace and tell the king's family that their time is over. The crowd surged forward, Brutus at its head, Collatinus and Valerius and Lucretius beside him. They marched through the streets of Rome, their numbers growing with every block as more people joined them, until it seemed like half the city was moving toward the palace. They found the palace gates closed and guarded, but the guards looked at the massive crowd approaching and made a wise decision. They stepped aside. They weren't going to die defending a regime that had just lost the people's support. The crowd poured into the palace, but they found it nearly empty. Tarquin's sons, Titus and Arones, had apparently fled when they heard what was happening. Talia was there, along with some servants and a few guards who hadn't run. Brutus confronted her directly. This woman who had driven over her father's corpse, who had supported every one of her husband's tyrannies. Your son raped Lucretia, Brutus told her. His voice hard. She's dead because of him. And now Rome is done with you, done with your whole family. You have until sunset to leave the city. If you're still here when the sun goes down, the people will decide your fate, and I don't think you'll enjoy their judgment." Tullia looked at him with contempt, but also with calculation. She was many things, but she wasn't stupid. She could see that this was over, that the revolution had succeeded, that staying in Rome would mean death. "My husband will return with an army," she said coldly. "He'll crush this rebellion, and you'll all die screaming." "Perhaps," Brutus agreed, "but you won't be here to see it. Now get out." Tullia left, taking with her what possessions she could carry, and a small group of loyal servants. She walked through the streets of Rome, through crowds of people who had once bowed to her, and now jeered at her. Some threw refuse, others spat. She bore it all with her head high, her face a mask of rage and contempt, which really was the only way she could have handled it. After everything she'd done, after driving over her own father, begging for mercy would have been completely out of character. Say what you will about Tullia, but she committed to her choices. Meanwhile, Brutus and the other leaders were organizing the revolution into something more than just mob action. They needed to secure the city, needed to make sure Tarquin couldn't simply return with his army and retake control. The news of the uprising reached the Roman army at Ardea quickly. One of Tarquin's men rode hard from Rome to bring word that the city was in revolt, that the people were demanding the end of the monarchy, that the royal family was being expelled. Tarquin's first reaction was fury. How dare they? How dare these insignificant people rise up against their rightful king? He would return to Rome immediately, put down this rebellion, execute the ringleaders, and restore order through whatever force was necessary. But when he tried to leave camp with a force of loyal soldiers, he found his way blocked, not by enemies but by his own army. Brutus had been clever. He had sent messages to the army at Ardea, telling them what Sextus had done, how the people of Rome had risen up against tyranny, how they were declaring the city free from the rule of kings, and he had sent one additional message, specifically for the soldiers. If they supported the revolution, they would be welcomed home as citizens of a free Rome. If they supported Tarquin, they would be fighting their own families, their own fathers and brothers and sons, who were even now in the Forum, declaring their freedom. The soldiers chose Rome over the king. Not all of them, but enough. When Tarquin tried to march toward the city, his own army refused to follow. Officers deserted, taking their men with them. Soldiers who had fought for Tarquin in a dozen campaigns suddenly remembered that they were Romans first, and the king's men second. Tarquin, seeing that his army was dissolving around him, that even his own sons were now in danger from the revolution, made the only choice he could make. He fled. He took his immediate family, his sons Titus and Arruns, and eventually Sextus when he could be located, and headed for the Etruscan city of Carrhae, where he had family connections and hoped to find support. Back in Rome, Brutus was addressing the people again, this time in a more formal assembly. "The king has fled," he announced. "Rome is free from tyranny, but we must decide what comes next. We cannot simply have no government. That way lies chaos. We need leadership, but leadership that the people choose and that the people can remove if it becomes tyrannical." He outlined a plan, a new system of government. Instead of one king ruling for life, Rome would be governed by 2 consuls elected annually by the people. These consuls would have equal power, each able to veto the other's decisions, so that no single man could become a tyrant. They would serve for only 1 year, then return to private life, making way for new leaders. "The Senate," Brutus continued, "will be restored to its proper role as advisors and representatives of the people. No more will it be a rubber stamp for a tyrant's decrees. It will debate, it will question, it will provide wisdom and counsel to the consuls." It was a radical restructuring of Roman government, replacing monarchy with what would come to be called a republic, a government of the people, by the people, for the people, or at least by the noble families who had the wealth and status to participate in politics, which was more limited than modern democratic ideals, but was still revolutionary for its time. "We need our first consuls," Valerius pointed out. "Someone has to start this new government, to show that it can work." The crowd knew who they wanted. The chant started somewhere in the back and spread forward. "Brutus, Brutus, Brutus." Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had pretended to be stupid for years to survive, who had sworn the oath over Lucretia's body, who had led the revolution against the monarchy, was the obvious choice. For his colleague, they chose Collatinus, Lucretia's widowed husband, the man whose wife's death had sparked this entire revolution. So it was decided. Rome's first 2 consuls were elected by acclamation of the people. Brutus and Collatinus took office, not as kings but as elected officials, servants of the people rather than masters of them. One of their first official acts was to pass a law declaring that never again would any king rule in Rome. The very word rex, king, became almost a curse, something Romans would speak of with hatred and fear for centuries to come. They had experienced tyranny, and they were determined never to repeat that mistake. Another early act was to confiscate all property belonging to the Tarquin family. The palace on the Palatine was stripped of its contents. The royal lands were distributed or dedicated to public use. Everything the Tarquins had accumulated through their years of power was taken from them, ensuring that even if they returned, they would return as paupers rather than as wealthy exiles who could buy support. There was an interesting postscript to Collatinus's time as consul. Some Romans, recognizing that he bore the name Tarquinius, he was, after all, Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, became uncomfortable with having anyone named Tarquinius in a position of power. It seemed wrong somehow, inappropriate. Even though Collatinus had been one of the leaders of the revolution, Brutus, with great reluctance, asked his friend and colleague to resign for the good of the new republic. Collatinus, heartbroken but understanding the political necessity, agreed. He went into voluntary exile in the town of Lavinium, leaving Rome in peace. It was a harsh decision, but it showed something important about the new Rome, that principles mattered more than individual friendships, that the republic was more important than any one person. Even the heroes of the revolution had to submit to the greater good. Publius Valerius was elected to replace Collatinus, and the new government continued to organize itself, to create the laws and institutions that would govern Rome for centuries to come. Meanwhile, Tarquin the Proud, the last king of Rome, sat in exile in Cairo, plotting his return. He had lost Rome, yes, but he hadn't lost his ambition or his conviction that he deserved to rule. He would spend the rest of his life trying to regain his throne, trying to convince other cities to help him, trying to overthrow the republic and restore the monarchy. He would fail. Every attempt would fail. But he would keep trying until the day he died, unable to accept that his reign was over, that Rome had chosen freedom over his rule. Back in Rome, in the forum where Brutus had displayed Lucretia's body and called for revolution, the people were celebrating. They were free. They had overthrown a tyrant and created something new, something that had never existed before in quite this form. A republic, a government of laws rather than kings, of elected officials rather than hereditary rulers. It wouldn't always be perfect. The republic would have its own problems, its own corruption, its own failures, but it would last for nearly 500 years, would conquer most of the known world, would create a civilization that would influence human history for millennia. And it all started here, with a woman's death and a man's oath, with the rage of a people who decided they would rather govern themselves, however imperfectly, than submit to the perfect tyranny of a king. The age of Roman kings was over. The age of the Roman Republic had begun. Tarquinius Superbus was not the sort of man to accept defeat gracefully. He had spent his entire life taking what he wanted, and what he wanted now was his throne back. The fact that the Roman people had decisively rejected him, had driven him out and declared they would never again accept a king, seemed to him merely an inconvenient obstacle rather than a legitimate expression of popular will, which tells you something about how tyrants think, really. When everyone in a city rises up and tells you to leave, and you interpret that as a temporary setback rather than a clear message, you might not be as good at reading social cues as you think you are. From his exile in Cari, Tarquin began writing letters, sending messengers, calling in favours from Etruscan cities that had benefited from his military campaigns or diplomatic connections. He presented himself not as a deposed tyrant, but as a legitimate king, unjustly overthrown by a small group of conspirators. The fact that those conspirators included most of Rome's population was a detail he chose to downplay. His first appeal was to the cities of Veii and Tarquinia, powerful Etruscan centres with which he had family connections. The message was simple: Rome had illegally expelled its rightful king, and the Etruscan cities should help restore proper order. Also, there would be rewards for any city that helped him regain his throne. The Etruscan cities listened politely, but did nothing. Oh, they were sympathetic, certainly. They expressed outrage at Rome's treatment of its king. They sent strongly worded letters to the new Roman government. But actual military support? Actual armies marching on Rome to restore Tarquin? That was another matter entirely. The problem was that Tarquin, however much he might have been a legitimate king of Rome, was also known to be difficult, demanding, and not particularly good at keeping agreements. The Etruscan cities had dealt with him before. They knew what he was like. and the prospect of helping him regain power so he could then ignore their interests and make unreasonable demands wasn't terribly appealing. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the new republic was discovering that governing without a king was harder than simply declaring you didn't want a king anymore. The two consuls, Brutus and Valerius, were trying to create a functioning government from scratch, trying to establish procedures and precedents when there were no procedures or precedents to follow. How long should a Senate meeting last? Valerius asked Brutus one evening, after a particularly lengthy and contentious session. I don't know, Brutus admitted. Under the kings, meetings lasted as long as the king felt like talking, but we're not kings, clearly not. Or we could just decree that meetings end when we're tired, and everyone would have to accept it. We could propose that as a law, Brutus suggested, and the Senate would debate it for 3 hours before voting it down just to prove they can. Valerius replied, "Welcome to representative government." But there were more serious problems than the length of Senate meetings. Some Romans, particularly among the patrician families who had benefited from Tarquin's regime, were beginning to have second thoughts about this whole republic experiment. Yes, Tarquin had been a tyrant, but he had also been predictable in his way. You knew where you stood with him. This new system, with its elections and debates and shared power, was messy and uncertain. Among those having second thoughts were, ironically, two of Brutus's own sons, Titus and Tiberius. They had grown up in relative privilege, had expected to inherit their father's position and influence in Roman society. But in the new republic, positions couldn't be inherited. They had to be earned through election, through service, through the support of fellow citizens. The young men found this arrangement unsatisfying. They weren't alone. A group of young patricians, sons of noble families, began meeting in secret. They told themselves they were simply discussing politics, exploring their concerns about the new government. But gradually, their discussions took a more dangerous turn. My father was an advisor to the king, one would say. Now he's just one senator among many. His voice no more important than anyone else's. Rome was stronger under Tarquin, another would argue. We were conquering our neighbours, building monuments, expanding our power. Now we spend all our time debating procedure. Perhaps, someone else would venture carefully, perhaps we were too hasty in expelling the royal family. It was dangerous talk, the kind of conversation that could get you labelled a traitor to the new republic. But these young men felt safe in their private meetings, confident that they could speak freely among friends. What they didn't know was that one of their number, a young man named Vindicius, was troubled by these conversations. He was a slave in one of the patrician households, privy to these meetings because he served wine and food during them, assumed to be too lowly to matter or to understand political discussions. But Vindicius understood perfectly well what he was hearing, and it worried him. The conspirators weren't just complaining anymore. They were planning. They had made contact with the Tarquins in exile, had agreed to help restore the monarchy in exchange for positions of power and privilege in the restored regime. They were planning to open Rome's gates to an army that Tarquin was supposedly assembling, to murder the consuls, to overthrow the republic. Vindicius faced a difficult choice. He was a slave, property rather than a person in the eyes of Roman law. Speaking against his master could get him killed, but if he said nothing, the republic would fall and Rome would return to tyranny. He chose to speak. Vindicius went to Valerius, who had a reputation as the more approachable of the two consuls, and told him everything. The meetings, the conspirators, the plot to restore Tarquin, and, most painfully, he revealed that among the conspirators were Brutus's own sons. Valerius listened to the slave's testimony with growing horror. If this was true, and if he could prove it, the conspiracy could be crushed before it succeeded. But the involvement of Brutus's sons complicated everything. How could he tell his colleague that his own children were plotting to overthrow the government they had fought to establish? But tell him he must. So Valerius brought Vindicius to Brutus, and had him repeat his story. Brutus listened without expression, his face a mask that revealed nothing of what he was feeling. When Vindicius finished, there was a long silence. "You're certain?" Brutus finally asked. "You're certain my sons are involved?" "Yes, consul," Vindicius said quietly. "I heard them myself, saw them accept letters from the Tarquins, watched them plan the uprising. I wish it were not true, but it is." Another long silence. Then Brutus stood. "We arrest them all," he said, his voice flat. "Everyone Vindicius has named. We seize the letters as evidence. We hold a public trial, and we let the law decide their fate." "Brutus," Valerius said gently. "They're your sons. I know who they are," Brutus replied. and that's exactly why there can be no exception for them. If the Republic is to mean anything, if law is to mean anything, then it must apply equally to everyone, even to the sons of the consul who helped establish it. So the conspirators were arrested, all of them, including Titus and Tiberius Junius. The letters were seized and read aloud in the forum as evidence. The plot was exposed in all its details. How they planned to open the gates, where they planned to strike first, what promises Tarquin had made to them. The trial was held publicly, with the evidence presented before the assembled people. The conspirators didn't really try to deny it. The letters were damning, and Vindicius's testimony was detailed and credible. Instead, they argued that they had acted for Rome's good, that the Republic was weak and chaotic, that Rome needed a strong king rather than this experiment in shared governance. It was not a persuasive defense. The people voted for conviction. The sentence was death, as it had to be for treason of this magnitude. And now came the terrible moment that would define Brutus's legacy forever. As consul, Brutus was responsible for carrying out the sentence. Traditionally, the consuls themselves oversaw executions, particularly for crimes against the state, which meant that Brutus would have to watch his own sons die. He could have delegated this duty to Valerius. No one would have blamed him, but Brutus had meant what he said about the law applying equally to everyone, about there being no exceptions even for the families of those in power. So on the day of execution, Brutus sat in his consular chair in the forum, his face expressionless, and watched as his two sons were brought forward. They were bound, stripped to the waist in the traditional manner, for those condemned to death. The lictor stood ready with his rods and axe, the instruments of Roman justice. Titus and Tiberius looked at their father, perhaps expecting some last-minute reprieve, some sign of parental mercy. But Brutus gave no sign. He sat motionless, his face like stone. The lictor raised his axe, and Brutus watched as his sons were executed, never flinching, never looking away, never showing by word or gesture that this was anything other than the necessary application of law to criminals who had betrayed their city. It was a terrible moment, the kind of thing that defines a man and a civilization. Brutus could have saved his sons. He could have found some legal technicality, some way to commute their sentences, some exception to the rule, but he didn't, because he understood that the Republic was more important than his personal feelings, that the law had to be absolute or it meant nothing. The Romans watching understood what they were seeing. This was not a king ruling by personal whim, showing mercy to his favourites and harshness to his enemies. This was justice, blind and impartial, applying equally to the consul's sons as it would to anyone else. It was horrible, but it was also the foundation of everything the Republic claimed to be. After it was over, after his sons were dead, Brutus stood and walked away without a word. He went to his home, closed the door, and no one saw him for 3 days. What he did in those 3 days, what grief or rage or regret he experienced, no one knows. The sources don't tell us. When he emerged, he resumed his duties as consul as though nothing had happened, and never spoke of his sons again. Vindicius, the slave who had exposed the conspiracy, was granted his freedom and citizenship for his service to the Republic. It was an extraordinary honour, a recognition that virtue and loyalty mattered more than social status. He took the name Publius Vindicius, the Publius being a praenomen granted to him as a free citizen. Meanwhile, Tarquin was still in exile, still plotting. The conspiracy's failure hadn't discouraged him. If anything, it had shown him that there were Romans who still supported the idea of monarchy, who could be rallied if the right opportunity presented itself. He turned his attention to Lars Porsena, the powerful king of the Etruscan city of Clusium. Porsena was one of the most significant rulers in Etruria, commanding substantial military forces and wielding considerable diplomatic influence. If anyone could help Tarquin regain his throne, it was Porsena. Tarquin travelled to Clusium and made his appeal. He presented himself as a fellow king, unjustly deposed by rebellious subjects, arguing that if Rome's uprising succeeded, it would inspire similar rebellions in other cities. The overthrow of legitimate monarchy was a threat to all kings, Tarquin argued. Porsena should help restore Tarquin, not as a favour, but as a matter of self-interest. It was a clever argument, one that played on Porsena's concerns about political stability and the sanctity of monarchical rule, and it worked, at least partially. Porsena agreed to lead an army against Rome, though whether he truly intended to restore Tarquin, or simply saw an opportunity to extend his own power, is debatable. Word reached Rome that Lars Porsena was marching south with a substantial army. This was a crisis of a different magnitude than the internal conspiracy. Porsena was a serious military threat, commanding experienced troops and substantial resources. If he besieged Rome, if he cut off food supplies and waited out the defenders, the young republic might not survive. The Romans prepared for war. The consuls levied troops, strengthened the city's defences, and prepared for a siege. But they also sent envoys to Porsenna, hoping to negotiate, to explain why they had expelled Tarquin, and to argue that Rome's internal politics were not Porsenna's concern. The envoys were received politely, but accomplished little. Porsenna listened to their arguments, nodded thoughtfully, and continued his march toward Rome. He set up camp on the far side of the Tiber, his army visible from the city walls, a clear and present threat. But something interesting happened during the subsequent negotiations. Porsenna, meeting with Roman envoys and observing the city from his camp, began to develop a grudging respect for what the Romans had accomplished. This republic experiment was clearly working better than Tarquin had suggested. The city seemed orderly, the people determined, the government functional. This wasn't a city in chaos desperately needing a king to restore order. This was a city that had chosen its path and was committed to defending it. Moreover, talking with the Romans, Porsenna heard their side of the story. Not just about the political structure they had created, but about why they had expelled Tarquin. They told him about Lucretia, about the forced labour, about the murders and confiscations and the degradation of the Senate. They painted a picture not of a legitimate king wrongly deposed, but of a tyrant finally overthrown by a people who had endured too much. Porsenna was, by all accounts, a relatively just and reasonable ruler himself. He believed in monarchy, certainly, but he also believed in governing well, in maintaining the support of one's subjects, in ruling with some measure of consent rather than pure force. The Romans' description of Tarquin's rule troubled him. "Did you really drive your chariot over your father's corpse?" Porsenna asked Tullia when she and Tarquin met with him to press their case. Tullia lifted her chin defiantly. "I did what was necessary to support my husband's claim to the throne. I see," Porsenna said thoughtfully. And perhaps in that moment he began to understand that Tarquin's version of events might not be entirely accurate. The siege continued, but it was half-hearted. Porsenna cut off some supply routes but didn't press the attack with full force. He seemed to be going through the motions, fulfilling his promise to Tarquin, without fully committing to restoring him to power. There were skirmishes, some of them famous in later Roman history. A young soldier named Horatius Cocles supposedly held the bridge over the Tiber single-handedly while it was demolished behind him, preventing Porsenna's army from crossing. A noble named Mucius Scaevola supposedly infiltrated the enemy camp to assassinate Porsenna, killed the wrong man by mistake, and then thrust his right hand into a fire to show he didn't fear pain, impressing Porsenna with Roman determination. How much of these stories is literally true, and how much is later embellishment is hard to say, but they capture something important about the mood of the time. The Romans were willing to sacrifice everything to preserve their freedom, and that determination impressed even their enemies. Eventually, Porsenna made his decision. He negotiated a peace with Rome that didn't include restoring Tarquin to power. Instead, he extracted some concessions, hostages perhaps, or trade agreements, that gave him something to show for his campaign, and then he withdrew his army and went home. Tarquin was furious. He had been so close, had an army at Rome's gates, and Porsenna had simply given up. The Etruscan king had betrayed him, had listened to the Romans' lies and abandoned a fellow monarch, but there was nothing Tarquin could do about it. Without Porsenna's support, he had no realistic hope of military intervention, so he tried other approaches, appealing to different cities, offering different incentives, plotting different schemes. Each attempt failed. Some cities refused him outright. Others expressed sympathy but provided no actual help. Still others actively supported Rome against him, preferring to deal with the Republic than risk the chaos of helping a deposed king regain power. Years passed. Tarquin grew older, more bitter, more desperate. His sons Titus and Oruns died in one of the early battles against Rome. Some sources say fighting for their father's restoration. Others say they were killed in the initial revolt. Sextus, the son whose crime had started this whole chain of events, was assassinated in the Latin town of Gabii, killed by people who remembered his father's treachery against their city. Tullia died in exile, having seen her ambitions turn to ashes, her family destroyed, her name become a byword for evil among the Romans. No one recorded where she was buried or mourned her passing. And Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome, the proud tyrant who had believed himself indispensable, lived on in exile, moving from city to city, always hoping, always plotting, never accepting that his reign was truly over. He died in Cumae, a Greek city in southern Italy, probably in 495 BCE, 14 years after being driven from Rome. He was buried there, far from the city he had ruled, mourned by no one except perhaps himself for the power he had lost and would never regain. Back in Rome, when news of his death arrived, there was no great celebration. The Republic had moved on. The threat he represented had faded years ago. He had become irrelevant, a cautionary tale about tyranny rather than an actual danger. The age of kings was truly over, and Rome was ready for whatever came next. The death of Tarquinius Superbus in distant Cumae might have seemed like the end of the story, the final chapter in the tale of Rome's kings, but in many ways it was really just the beginning of a new Rome, a new way of thinking about power and government, a new relationship between rulers and ruled, that would shape Western civilization for millennia. To understand the full impact of Tarquin's reign and its aftermath, we need to look at what changed in Rome, what lessons the Romans learned, and how the memory of the last king shaped everything that came after. First, there was the immediate practical matter of completing the great temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill. Tarquin had devoted enormous resources to this project, had forced countless Romans to labor on it, had made it the centerpiece of his building program. When he was expelled from Rome, the temple stood nearly complete but unfinished, a monument to tyrannical ambition waiting for its final dedication. The Republic faced a dilemma. Should they complete the temple, this symbol of Tarquin's reign, or should they abandon it? Let it stand as an incomplete rebuke to monarchical excess? In the end, practical concerns won out over symbolic ones. The temple was too far along to abandon, too important religiously to leave unfinished. Jupiter Optimus Maximus, Jupiter best and greatest, deserved his temple, regardless of who had started building it. So the work continued under the Republic, funded now not by royal confiscation but by public taxation and voluntary contributions. The temple was finally dedicated in 509 BCE, the first year of the Republic, though some sources place it a few years later. Marcus Horatius Tullius, one of the early consuls, performed the dedication ceremony. He stood on the Capitoline Hill, surrounded by crowds of Romans, and consecrated the temple not to the glory of a king, but to the glory of Rome itself and the gods who protected it. It must have been a strange moment. Here was Tarquin's greatest achievement, the monument he had poured resources and lives into, being dedicated in a Rome that had rejected everything he stood for. The temple would stand for centuries, would become one of the most important religious sites in the Roman world, would be rebuilt and expanded and renovated by generation after generation of Romans who never knew the name Tarquin except as a warning. The irony would not have been lost on the Romans. Tarquin had wanted to be remembered, had wanted his reign to be immortalized in stone and terracotta, and it was minus, but not in the way he had hoped. His temple stood as a reminder not of royal greatness, but of the achievements possible when a people worked together, when they built for the glory of their gods and their city rather than for one man's vanity. The same was true of the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system. It continued to function, to drain the Forum and the low-lying areas, to make Rome healthier and more livable. But no one praised Tarquin for it. Instead they praised Roman engineering, Roman determination, Roman civic virtue. The tyrant who had built it was forgotten. The system itself became part of Rome's identity, which really is the ultimate defeat for someone like Tarquin. He wanted eternal fame, and what he got was eternal infamy, with even his legitimate achievements credited to everyone except him. But Tarquin's most lasting legacy was not what he built, but what he taught the Romans to fear and reject. The very word rex, king, became almost unspeakable in polite Roman society. For centuries afterward, calling someone a king, or accusing them of seeking kingship, was one of the worst insults imaginable. Romans who achieved great power, who accumulated honors and victories and authority, had to be very careful never to seem like they wanted to be king. This fear of monarchy shaped Roman politics in profound ways. The entire structure of the Republic was designed to prevent any one person from accumulating too much power. 2 consuls instead of 1, each able to veto the other. Annual elections instead of lifetime appointments. The Senate as a check on executive authority. Tribunes to protect the common people from patrician excess. Multiple overlapping jurisdictions and responsibilities. It was inefficient, certainly. It was messy and contentious, and often frustrating, but it was designed to be that way. Designed to make it nearly impossible for anyone to become another Tarquin, to seize absolute power and rule as a tyrant. "We suffered under kings once," a Roman senator said in a speech recorded by later historians, "and we will never suffer under them again. Better to have chaos and freedom than order and slavery." It was this attitude, this deep-seated suspicion of concentrated power, that would eventually bring down even the Republic itself. Centuries later, when Julius Caesar accumulated unprecedented authority and seemed to be aiming at kingship, though he was careful never to accept the actual title, the senators who assassinated him justified their actions by invoking the memory of Tarquinius Superbus and the Republic's founding principles. We killed him to prevent him from becoming a king. Brutus, a descendant of the original Brutus who had expelled Tarquin, would say in defense of Caesar's assassination, "We did what our ancestor did, what any free Roman must do when faced with tyranny." The irony, of course, was that killing Caesar didn't restore the Republic. It led to civil war and eventually to the establishment of the Roman Empire, with emperors who had all the power of kings but were very, very careful never to use that particular word, which just goes to show that you can learn the wrong lessons from history, or learn the right lessons but apply them badly, or learn exactly the right lessons and still have things go wrong because history is complicated and human nature is messy. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in the early Republic, in those first years after Tarquin's expulsion, the Romans were still figuring out what it meant to govern themselves. The story of Lucretia became foundational to Roman identity. She was held up as the model of feminine virtue, the perfect Roman matron whose honor was more important than her life. Young Roman girls learned her story as an example of how a proper woman should behave. The fact that she was the victim of rape, that she had done nothing wrong, seemed less important to later moralists than the fact that she had chosen death over dishonor, which is, frankly, a pretty terrible lesson to teach. But the Romans, like most ancient peoples, had some problematic ideas about honor, shame, and women's roles in society. The important thing from a political perspective was that Lucretia's story provided an emotional foundation for the Republic. It gave Romans a reason to hate the Tarquins that went beyond abstract political principles. It made the revolution personal, visceral, impossible to forget. "Remember Lucretia" became a rallying cry whenever Romans needed to remind themselves why they had rejected monarchy. It was their version of "Remember the Alamo" or "Remember Pearl Harbor," a personal tragedy that symbolized larger political truths. Brutus, too, became a legendary figure. The story of him watching his son's execution, of choosing duty to the Republic over paternal love, was told and retold as an example of perfect Roman virtue. He represented the ideal of putting the state above personal interest, of making painful sacrifices for the greater good. Later Romans would name their sons Brutus, in honor of him. They would invoke his example in political speeches. They would hold up his actions as the standard by which all public servants should be judged. Whether the historical Brutus was really as stoic and selfless as the legend suggested is impossible to say, but the legend itself mattered more than the reality. These stories, Lucretia's rape and suicide, Brutus's terrible sacrifice, Horatius holding the bridge, Mucus Scaevola burning his hand, became the founding myths of the Roman Republic. They were told to children, depicted in art, referenced in political debates, used to teach moral lessons about virtue, courage, and civic duty. And at the center of all these stories, as the villain whose actions made heroism necessary, was Tarquinius Superbus. In later Roman literature, Tarquin became almost a caricature of tyranny. He was portrayed as cruel, arrogant, impious, lustful, possessing every vice that a ruler could have. His wife Tullia was painted as equally monstrous, the evil queen who drove her father's corpse and encouraged her husband's worst impulses. Their son Sextus was the privileged rapist, the embodiment of royal entitlement and disregard for others' rights. How accurate were these portrayals? It's hard to say. The sources we have were all written after the fall of the monarchy, by people invested in justifying the Republic and demonizing the kings who preceded it. They had every reason to make Tarquin seem as terrible as possible, to create a clear moral distinction between the bad old days of monarchy and the virtuous new era of republican government. But even allowing for exaggeration and propaganda, it's clear that Tarquin was genuinely unpopular, that his methods were harsh, and that his expulsion was welcomed by most Romans. You don't get a unanimous uprising like the one Brutus led, if the ruler is actually beloved and the opposition is just a small group of malcontents. The name Superbus, the Proud, is itself interesting. Pride, in the Roman moral universe, was not necessarily a vice. Romans valued dignitas, a sense of personal dignity and worth. They admired men who carried themselves with gravitas, with weightiness and seriousness. But superbia was different. It meant excessive pride, arrogance, the kind of haughtiness that placed oneself above others, that refused to acknowledge any limits or any equals. It was pride that had crossed the line into contempt for everyone else. That Tarquin earned this epithet. that it stuck to him so completely that history knows him by it, tells us something important. He wasn't just a king who ruled firmly or a military leader who was confident in his abilities. He was someone whose fundamental attitude toward other people was contemptuous, who genuinely believed he was superior to everyone around him and that this superiority justified whatever he chose to do. It's this attitude, more than any specific action, that made him intolerable to the Romans. They might have accepted a harsh king if he was harsh in service of Rome's interests. They might have accepted forced labor if it was clearly necessary and applied fairly. What they couldn't accept was a king who made it clear that he viewed them as tools to be used, as subjects who existed to serve his will, rather than citizens with rights and dignity. In the decades after Tarquin's expulsion, as the Republic established itself and developed its institutions, Romans would occasionally debate whether they had made the right choice. Usually this happened during times of crisis, when the Republic seemed weak or divided, when strong leadership seemed attractive. Perhaps a king wouldn't be so bad. Someone might suggest during a particularly contentious political dispute, at least decisions would get made quickly, and inevitably, someone else would respond, "Remember Tarquin." Those 2 words were enough. They carried the weight of everything the last king had represented. The murders, the forced labor, the degraded Senate, the confiscations, the contempt, and finally the rape that had catalyzed the revolution. Whatever problems the Republic had, whatever inefficiencies or frustrations came with shared governance, they were preferable to returning to that. The Roman Republic would last for nearly 500 years, from 509 BCE to 27 BCE. It would conquer Italy, then the Mediterranean world, then territories stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia. It would create legal systems, architectural innovations, military organizations, and political institutions that would influence human civilization for millennia. And it all started with the rejection of one man, one family, one system of government that had proven itself unworthy of Roman loyalty. Tarquin himself, dying in exile in Cumae, probably never understood this. He probably believed until his last breath that he had been a good king, that the Romans had been ungrateful, that his expulsion was unjust. Tyrants rarely recognize themselves as tyrants. They see their actions as necessary, their methods as justified, their treatment of others as appropriate given their superior position. But history has rendered its judgment, and that judgment is clear. Tarquinius Superbus was the last king of Rome because he was exactly the kind of king that made Romans decide they wanted no more kings at all. In the Forum Romanum, in the heart of what would become one of the greatest cities in human history, there stands, or stood, in ancient times, a simple marker. The exact location is disputed, the marker itself long since lost to time, but according to tradition, it marked the spot where Brutus first called upon the Romans to expel the Tarquins and establish the Republic. For centuries, Romans would pause at that spot, would remember the day their ancestors chose freedom over subjection, would remind themselves why the Republic mattered. It was a small thing, a simple stone or column, but it represented something enormous, the moment when a people decided that they would rather govern themselves, however imperfectly, than submit to the perfect tyranny of one man's rule. And standing on the Capitoline hill above the Forum, visible from that marker, and from everywhere else in Rome, was the great temple to Jupiter, completed despite Tarquin's fall, standing as a reminder that Rome's achievements belonged to Rome, not to any individual ruler. Tarquinius Superbus wanted to be remembered. He wanted his name to echo through history, wanted his achievements to be celebrated, wanted to be recognized as one of Rome's great kings. He got his wish. In a way, his name did echo through history. But not as a great king, as a terrible warning, as the example of what happens when power is abused, when dignity becomes arrogance, when a ruler forgets that his position exists to serve his people rather than the reverse. Every Roman child learned his story. Every politician invoked his name when warning against the concentration of power. Every general who achieved too much success. Every consul who seemed too ambitious. Every leader who appeared to be reaching beyond his station was compared to Tarquin and found the comparison uncomfortable. "You're acting like Tarquin" was perhaps the most damning accusation in Roman political life. It meant you were arrogant, tyrannical, contemptuous of law and custom. It meant you had forgotten that you were a servant of the Republic, not its master, and so the last king of Rome achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind he wanted. He lived on in memory as the tyrant whose excesses destroyed monarchy itself in Rome, as the cautionary tale that shaped a civilization, as the example that taught generations of Romans what kind of leadership to reject. The age of Roman kings ended with Tarquinius Superbus. but in a sense he never left Rome. He remained there in memory, in cautionary tales, in the very structure of the government created in opposition to everything he represented. His ghost haunted the Republic for its entire existence, a permanent reminder of what Rome had been and had chosen never to be again. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all. Tarquin wanted power, wanted to be remembered as great, wanted his legacy to endure. He got his legacy, but it was the legacy of showing Rome exactly what it didn't want to be, of inspiring a political revolution that changed the world, of being the bad example that taught one of history's most important lessons, not the legacy he hoped for, but a legacy nonetheless, carved not in stone or written in books of honor, but in the fundamental structure of Roman government and the Roman soul. The last king of Rome taught the Romans to hate kings, and in doing so he changed history forever. That's the story of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome. Sleep well, and may your dreams be more peaceful than his reign.